Chapter 1. After a night of heavy snow, there was only a touch of white left between heaven and earth. The furnace that was boiling the medicine made a gululu sound. The two little maids who were responsible for looking after the furnace were whispering together. Suddenly, two strong servants came over and took away the medicine pot without saying a word. "Hey! What are you doing? This is the young master's medicine." The little maid pulled the hand of the person beside her and chased after them. She didn't notice that as they got closer and closer to the main courtyard, the maids behind her showed an obvious look of panic. In the bedroom with the doors and windows closed, a young man in a snow-white fox fur coat was half leaning on the bed and coughing from time to time. His long black hair slid down his cheeks and his skin was so white that it was almost transparent. "Are you feeling better? I already said that the weather is cold recently and told you to wear more clothes." Junbei, who was relieved that his eldest son had finally woken up. If something happened to his eldest son at this juncture, the consequences were not something the Junbei who residents could bear. "There are no outsiders now. Father, you don't have to pretend. What is the cause of my illness? Father, do you really not know?" The young man glanced at Junbei who and said leisurely, "What's more, whether father is worried about me or that person's blame, I'm afraid only you know. Shinyu, I'm here." Shinyu didn't care that his words provoked Junbei whose anger. If it was in his previous life, Shinyu would have scruples about the father-son relationship between him and Junbei who. Now that he was reborn, Shinyu didn't intend to wrong himself for anyone. "This matter is not up to you to throw a tantrum. You have to go to the palace even if you don't want to." Junbei who barely suppressed his anger and advised, "Father knows that you don't want to. If it was something else, you can go as you please. But for this matter, His Majesty personally ordered." Shinyu narrowed his eyes. No matter how dignified Junbei whose words were, it couldn't hide the absurd fact that he sent his legitimate son into the harem for his future. The emperor of the Great Huan Kingdom, Shang Junlin, had been on the throne for 7 years. Until now, the harem had been empty. Memorials urging the emperor to take in beauties were sent one after another, but Shang Junlin just ignored them. The ministers had already given up hope. One day, during the court session, Shang Junlin suddenly decreed that the son of Junbei who should enter the palace. After Shang Junlin ascended the throne, his behavior became more and more ruthless. No one dared to provoke him. Count Junbei did not even dare to ask. He hurriedly returned to his residence under the envious and jealous gazes of his colleagues. Other than Shinyu, Duke Junbei also had a concubine-born son. Although Dahuan was popular in the south, there was no such thing as the eldest son of the first wife marrying someone else. Logically speaking, the one entering the palace should be Duke Junbei's concubine-born son. However, this concubine-born son had a good mother, Madame Ayu. She whispered pillow talk in Duke Junbei's ear and moved his heart. Thus, the one entering the palace was replaced by Shinyu. No one expected that Count Junbei could really send his only legitimate son into the harem. Shinyu, who was told the news, was so angry that he fainted directly. Shinyu remembered that there was such an incident in his previous life. However, at that time, he was not willing to accept Count Junbei's obvious favoritism. He schemed to make Madame Ayu go for wool and come home shorn. In the end, the one entering the palace was his younger brother. In his second life, Count Junbei was still talking non-stop. He knew that this matter was difficult for Shinyu to accept. It was true that the harem of the current emperor was empty. However, it was also true that the emperor was temperamental and bloodthirsty. Shinyu was the eldest son of the first wife of Count Junbei. If he did not enter the palace, he could also have a bright future. On the contrary, if he entered the palace, it seemed that he could be favored, but no one knew what the emperor was thinking. After listening for a while, Shinyu felt more and more bored. How could Count Junbei not know the danger of entering the palace? He just didn't care. Compared to his own future, a son that he did not care about since childhood was nothing. "I know," he interrupted Count Junbei. "Father, you said so much just to let me enter the palace." "Okay, but I have a request." Count Junbei did not expect that Shinyu could figure it out so quickly. He was stunned for a moment and then said, "Say it." There is a servant girl in my yard who has dirty hands and feet. Since father is here, help me deal with her. Shun Yu was lying on the bed. His tone was unclear. If there is a problem with the servant girl, you can deal with it yourself. Why do you ask me to do it? Count Shunbei did not understand why the topic suddenly jumped to dealing with the servant girl. He was slightly confused. His eldest son had always had his own ideas. He had always dealt with similar matters by himself. It was the first time that he asked for help. For a moment, his mood was somewhat complicated. It involves Madame Yu. Of course, you have to deal with it. Shun Yu thought that in this life, he chose to enter the palace by himself. However, it did not mean that what Madame Yu and her son did could be written off. Young master, the medicine is here. The servant came in with the medicine. The smell of medicine filled the air. Count Shunbei frowned and stepped aside to let the servant bring the medicine to Shun Yu. You drink the medicine first. If there is anything else, we can talk about it later. Shun Yu's body was not good since childhood. Drinking medicine was a common occurrence. Smelling the medicine, he took the medicine without changing his expression. He picked up the spoon and gently stirred it. Count Shunbei saw that Shun Yu was holding the medicine without drinking it. He frowned even more. Just as he was about to say something, Shun Yu had already put down the spoon. The spoon and the medicine bowl collided, making a crisp sound. Shun Yu's cold voice sounded at the same time, "Bring in the people outside." 2 servant girls were brought in. One of them was holding a medicine jar in his hand. Count Shunbei did not understand. What is this? Father, you might as well let them talk about what they did. Yun Luo looked at the people kneeling below with a smile. Count Shunbei's line of sight moved to the 2 servant girls. The 2 servant girls were not old. The younger servant girl's face was full of confusion. The other servant girl's expression was somewhat thought-provoking. It was fear, trembling, and bewilderment. Count Shunbei's expression became serious. Speak, what did you do? It seemed that he was asking the 2 of them, but his eyes always fell on the servant girl who had an uncomfortable expression. The servant girl, Chun Yu, lowered her head and glanced at the young man who was half leaning on the bed. When she met the other side's emotionless eyes, she hurriedly looked away. This servant didn't do it on purpose. It was Madame Yu who used this servant's family to threaten this servant and let this servant add something to the young master's medicine, Chun Yu said while constantly kowtowing. This servant didn't do it willingly. I beg Count Shunbei, young master, please understand and spare this servant's life. Count Shunbei couldn't help but look back at Shun Yu. His son didn't seem to be surprised by this result. His eyes were half closed, and his expression couldn't be seen clearly. Count Shunbei turned back and sternly said, You know, slandering your master is a serious crime. You said that Madame Yu threatened you to drug the young master. Do you have evidence? This servant doesn't dare to lie. Chun Yu's forehead was already bleeding from kowtowing. Trembling, she took out a jade bracelet from her bosom and held it above her head with both hands. This was given to this servant by Madame Yu. Count Shunbei tilted his head. The attendant behind him stepped forward to take the bracelet and respectfully presented it to Count Shunbei. It was a high-quality jade bracelet. It was far from what a servant girl like Chun Yu could afford. Count Shunbei's eyes were sharp, and he recognized that this jade bracelet had once appeared on Madame Yu's hand. If father doesn't believe me, you can find a doctor to examine the medicine. Seeing Count Shunbei's hesitation, Shun Yu said. Since he was going to make trouble, Shun Yu naturally made preparations in advance. That servant girl had been ordered by Madame Yu to tamper with the medicine not once or twice. In his previous life, when he discovered it, his body was already half empty. After being reborn, the first thing Shun Yu did was to order people to find Chun Yu's family members who were under Madame Yu's control. Then, he waited for Chun Yu to make a move. As for how to make Chun Yu bite back against Madame Yu, since Chun Yu was willing to drug him for her family, naturally, she could also turn her sharp blade against Madame Yu for her family. The moment he saw the bracelet clearly, Count Shunbei already had a conclusion in his heart. He looked at his eldest son and suddenly realized that he seemed to have never recognized him clearly. What do you want? Shouldn't I ask you this question, father? Sun only hopes that you can handle it impartially. Sun is about to enter the palace. I believe that father also doesn't want Sun to enter the palace with resentment against the Count's Fu. Shunyu threw the question back. Count Shunbei had doted on Madame Ayu for more than 10 years. Shunyu wanted to see what choice Count Shunbei would make compared to his own future. By the way, father, don't let me wait for too long. I hope that you can give me a satisfactory answer before I enter the palace. Shunyu looked at Count Shunbei with a faint smile. Count Shunbei obviously looked sick and weak, but people who looked at him felt cold. There were still more than 10 days before he entered the palace. Shunyu didn't want to drag this matter until after he entered the palace. The reason was that Shunyu occupied the position of the eldest son of the Di family. These years, Madame Ayu had secretly done many things. If it wasn't for Shunyu's vigilance, she would have already succeeded. Count Shunbei looked at Shunyu with a heavy heart. For a moment, he felt that he almost didn't know this son of his. He suppressed all kinds of thoughts in his heart and nodded. If this matter is really related to Madame Ayu, I will not tolerate it. Count Shunbei left with 2 servant girls and the medicine jar. Not long after, Shunyu received the news that Count Shunbei had secretly invited a doctor. Why did young master give Count Shunbei full authority to handle Madame Ayu? Young master knew that Count Shunbei treated Madame Ayu. Everyone in Count Shunbei's mansion knew that Count Shunbei doted on Madame Ayu. It could be said that he would give her anything she wanted. If it wasn't for Da Huan's law that prohibited concubines from being promoted, the position of Count Shunbei's wife wouldn't have been vacant until now. It was also because of this reason that Madame Ayu regarded Shunyu as a thorn in her side. When Shunyu was young, he suffered many hidden losses from her. Slightly raising his head, Shunyu let the servant girl put on the cloak for him. He hugged the hot water bottle and sneered, no matter how much Count Shunbei dotes on Madame Ayu, he won't be muddle-headed at this time. After tightly wrapping himself, Shunyu went out. Shunyu turned around. When he saw the person's appearance, he was in a daze. The man was dressed in white and had an outstanding appearance. He was much younger than in his memory. Shunyu stared at him in a daze as he got closer and closer to himself. All kinds of feelings welled up in his heart. In his previous life, he had given everything to chase after his lover. In the end, he found out that everything was just a scam. The deep affection was fake. The unforgettable feelings were also fake. Shunyu would never forget the other person's discomfiture and disbelief when the conspiracy was exposed. Yes, who would have thought that Shunyu could be so crazy? He could turn the situation around at the last moment. On the eve of his ascension, he could also drag someone into the abyss. Why didn't you tell me about such a big thing? The man in white had a gentle expression and his eyes showed just the right amount of concern. When Shunyu saw this, he only felt that it was funny. A dignified prince didn't hesitate to lower himself to be friends with him. He used gentleness to weave a net of deception in the name of love just to trap him. It was no wonder that in his previous life, he had fallen head first into it. However, genius 1 second remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading URL, mbk50. CC. Chapter 2. There were some things that he only knew after Shunyu's death. For example, he knew that he was just a substitute. After Shunyu's death, he accidentally got a book. At that time, Shunyu was trapped in a grey world and was bored to death. Out of boredom, he opened the only thing in the space other than himself. It was a storybook, and the words were also missing limbs. Shunyu read the entire storybook in a guessing manner, and he had 10,000 curses in his heart that he wanted to curse. In the novel, he was a vicious villain who did evil everywhere and hindered the love of the protagonist. The protagonist in the novel was his brother, Shun Qingran, who was sent to the tyrant's harem. The protagonist was Shong Junyu, the king of Yu. Shun Qingran transmigrated with the knowledge of the future. Before he could show his skills, he was plotted by the villain Shunyu and sent to the tyrant's harem. After separating from his lover and being tortured by the tyrant, Shun Qingran's personality changed greatly. Later, after experiencing all kinds of things, he finally escaped from the palace and reunited with his lover. However, he found that his lover had someone else by her side, and that person was his enemy, Shen Yu. Shen Qingran quietly drove a wedge between Shen Yu and the King of Yu. On the eve of the King of Yu's ascension to the throne, he induced the King of Yu to get rid of Shen Yu. The two of them lived happily ever after. Of course, this was only the ending in the novel. Shen Yu really killed the King of Yu in his previous life. The novel unfolded from Shen Qingran's point of view. Many things were different from Shen Yu's memory. For example, Shen Yu helped the King of Yu to seize power and his hands were stained with blood. There was also the matter of the King of Yu using him as a substitute. Shen Yu himself didn't know when he became a substitute. When he thought that Shang Junyu used him as a substitute for Shen Qingran, Shen Yu felt disgusted. The last bit of affection he had for the King of Yu also disappeared. Seeing Prince Yu again, Shen Yu only lost her composure for a moment. She blinked her eyes and deliberately pretended to be unhappy. No matter what I say to you, it won't change anything. Besides, if I don't go, Shen Qingran will go. Maybe you can think of a way to let my good brother go instead of me. After saying that, Shen Yu looked at Prince Yu with interest. If what was recorded in the book was true, King Yu should have known Shen Qingran by this time. Moreover, there were some signs of love between them. Shen Yu wanted to verify if it was true. King Yu was silent for a while, then said dotingly and helplessly, "If I had a way, I definitely wouldn't let you enter the palace." She avoided talking about Shen Yu's proposal. Shen Yu did not expect him to be able to come up with a solution. If the Prince of Yu really had this kind of ability, in his previous life, he would not have had to work so hard to push the Prince of Yu onto the throne, racking his brains and scheming until the end of his life. Even if the Prince of Yu did not stab him in the back, in his previous life, he would not have lived for long. Since you don't have a way, why should I look for you? Shen Yu tilted her head, seemingly puzzled. King Yu always felt that Shen Yu's words today were full of thorns. He thought that the other party was in a bad mood, so he softly comforted her. The matter has not been decided yet. There must be a way. If it was said that he didn't want Chen Yu to enter the palace, Yu Wang definitely didn't want to. He came to the capital in disguise this time to develop his connections. Chen Yu was the most capable person he had chosen. Unless it was absolutely necessary, he didn't want to give up. It was not that he did not think of letting Shen Qingran replace Shen Yu to enter the palace, but he could not expose his true identity at this time. If he was discovered, all his plans would be in vain. Yes, King Yu did not use his true identity to approach Shen Yu. Shen Yu also did not intend to expose him at this time. If he exposed him too early, it would not be fun, right? Shen Yu lowered her eyes. Her palm-sized face was hidden behind the fur collar. She had a lovely and touching posture. Seeing this, King Yu could not help but take a step forward. He reached out his hand, wanting to touch her moving face. Shen Yu tilted her head, avoiding King Yu's touch. King Yu was stunned for a moment. He coughed and took back his hand as if nothing had happened. He wanted to say something, but when he saw Shen Yu's small face tilted to one side, showing a slightly stubborn appearance, he swallowed all his words. He thought that Shen Yu was worried about entering the palace. King Yu also did not expect that the emperor would let Zhen Bei who sent his son into the palace at this time. If he had waited for a while, he would not have been restrained and did not dare to protect his son. Avoiding King Yu's touch was completely a subconscious action of Shen Yu. Shen Yu was too lazy to guess what King Yu would think. After being disturbed by King Yu, her leisure mood to go out for a stroll was completely gone. Since he was unhappy, Shen Yu did not mind making the culprit even more unhappy. He looked back at King Yu and slowly said, "His Majesty's harem is empty. When I enter the palace, will I be able to get a unique honor? His Majesty must also like me. Otherwise, why would he only choose me to enter the palace for so many years? Don't you think so?" Shen Yu deliberately said this. When she said this, her eyes were fixed on the face of the man opposite her. Sure enough, before she finished speaking, she saw the anger that was trying to hide from the other party's face. Having interacted with the Prince of Yu for so long in his previous life, Shen Yu understood the Prince of Yu very well. The Prince of Yu thought highly of himself and regarded the throne of the Great Huan dynasty as something that was already in his bag. He could not tolerate others mentioning the good things about the current emperor in front of him, let alone being mentioned in such a manner by someone who regarded him as his own. Yu, I know you are not willing. I am also very sad. Of course, he was sad. Such a useful pawn was gone just like that. King Yu did not want his previous efforts to be in vain, so he could only appease her first. No matter what happens, my feelings for you will not change. Yu, as he said this, King Yu wanted to hold Shen Yu's hand. After being dodged again, he was puzzled. Yu. Who said I am not willing? Shen Yu looked at the man who was close to her. Her eyes were full of unconcealable passion. Your Majesty is brave and powerful. I have admired your Majesty for a long time. To be able to enter the palace to serve your Majesty, I can't ask for anything more. How can I be unwilling? Hearing Shen Yu's words, King Yu almost could not maintain the gentle expression on his face. It's good that you can think like this. Since I am going to enter the palace, it's better for us to keep a distance. You don't have to come to Count Bei's mansion to find me in the future. Shen Yu directly blocked all of King Yu's escape routes. She just did not explicitly say we will break off the relationship to King Yu. After being refuted several times, King Yu's face was very ugly. He did not come to find Shen Yu for this result. He originally wanted to appease her first. If Shen Yu was willing to help him pass the message in the palace, it would be better. But he was not willing to give up this pawn. Shen Yu. Yu, do you have to be like this? Shen Yu suddenly remembered his previous life. At that time, he had just fallen in love with King Yu. When he learned that he was going to be sent to the palace by Count Bei, he was angry and desperate. He even fell seriously ill. What was King Yu doing? Perhaps he was busy developing a relationship with his younger brother, who was a transmigrator, and whispering sweet nothings to each other. Compared with the affectionate man now, how ironic. If he remembered correctly, King Yu came to the capital in disguise this time for the young master of He family, who was imprisoned because he angered Tian Yang. In his previous life, because he rescued the young master of He family, King Yu received the unconditional support of He family and the power behind it. Especially the power behind He family, which played a decisive role in several important battles. Shen Yu did not have a deep impression of He family, but he was very interested in the power behind He family. Of course, he was more interested in how to get rid of King Yu's help. After remembering the young master of He family, Shen Yu lost interest in continuing to argue with King Yu. With a cold face, he said, "How I am does not seem to have anything to do with Gongzi. Also, I don't like the name Yu. Gongzi, don't call me that in the future." What do you mean you don't like it? You don't like it, right? King Yu was speechless. Yu, no, Gongzi-shan, are you trying to distance yourself from me? Shen Yu pretended to be embarrassed and looked at King Yu. I think it's better if you don't get to the bottom of it. What do you mean? King Yu faintly had a bad premonition. Actually, if it weren't for the fact that I can see a bit of His Majesty's shadow in you, I wouldn't pay attention to you. Shen Yu said this on purpose. In both his previous and current lives, he had very little contact with the emperor, let alone being deeply in love with someone. However, he still had an expression on his face that said, "You asked me to say it, so I'll say it if you don't know." It made people believe him. Blinking his eyes, Shen Yu continued, "Now, you also know that I'm going to enter the palace. Between you and me," King Yu almost fainted from anger. What did he say? Because he could enter the palace to see the emperor, he didn't need him anymore? King Yu took a deep breath to calm himself down. He kept reminding himself that he couldn't let his previous efforts go to waste. After calming down for a while, he couldn't calm down at all. When he thought that he might be regarded as that person's substitute, even if there was only a 1 in 10,000 chance, he couldn't calm himself down. You did it on purpose, didn't you? You're angry with me, so you deliberately said that. What did I do on purpose? Shen Yu impatiently interrupted him. Otherwise, why do you think I, the son of a dignified marquis, want to be friends with you and accommodate you everywhere? Don't say that we have the same interests. There are many people in the world who have the same interests as me. No matter what, Shen Yu was the only legitimate son of Count Bei. He was both handsome and talented. There were many people who wanted to be friends with him. Why did he choose him? King Yu didn't want to believe this fact. However, once he followed Shen Yu's train of thought, the more he thought about it, the more he felt that it was the case. What's more, he and the emperor were half-brothers, so they had similar eyebrows. Genius. 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading URL, mbk50. cc. Chapter 3. Shen Yu didn't care about how much of a psychological shadow he had left on Prince Yu. He returned to his residence in a good mood. Even meeting Shen Qingran on the way didn't ruin his good mood. After handing over the matter of Madame Yu to Count North, Shen Yu didn't stay idle. He ordered people to secretly send a lot of evidence to Count North. Shen Yu knew that with Count North's protection, it would be difficult to completely get rid of Madame Yu with this matter alone. But it didn't matter. His purpose wasn't to get rid of Madame Yu. Shen Yu ate and drank well every day. After a few days, his complexion was much better than when he had just woken up. Count North took away a group of people who were serving in the courtyard. Not long after, a new group was sent in. Then, high-quality utensils and clothes were continuously sent into the courtyard. No matter what was sent from outside, Shen Yu would accept it all. The newly sent servants should have been ordered by Count North to serve him wholeheartedly. Just by looking at the current situation, it was somewhat like the treatment a legitimate son of the Count North should have. The day of entering the palace was getting closer and closer. The palace sent people to serve Shen Yu. The things around him were gradually taken over by the palace servants. These people only did things silently and never pointed fingers at Shen Yu. Shen Yu was happy that Count North's people were excluded, so he tacitly allowed them to stay in the courtyard. It had to be said that these people were much more useful than the servants of the Count North. Especially every time he saw Count North and others suffer, it made Shen Yu feel more comfortable. During this period, Prince Yu didn't give up and sent people to secretly send in a few letters. Shen Yu didn't even look at them and directly threw them into the brazier. In the bright fire, some invisible shackles were burned away. The dark bottom of his eyes reflected the warm orange light, and the corners of his mouth unknowingly hooked up. "Young master." The servant pushed the door open and came in. When he saw the handsome figure sitting by the brazier, he didn't know why his heart turned cold. Shen Yu narrowed his eyes. "What's the matter?" "The Marquis invites you to the main hall." The manservant lowered his head, not daring to look at the young man sitting upright. The manservant was specially selected by Count Shen Bei and sent to Shen Yu's side. Before he came, he was ordered by Count Shen Bei to take good care of the young master and not neglect anything. After he came, he found that the young master, who didn't have much sense of presence in the mansion, was very different from what everyone imagined. "Let's go." Shen Yu clapped his hands and stood up. There were not many people in the main hall. After Shen Yu went in, Sir Zhenbei waved his hand to let some of the servants leave. Those who stayed were all trusted by Sir Zhenbei. Shen Yu raised his eyes and glanced around. He saw Madame Yu, who was standing below Count North, and Shen Qingran, who was confused. "Father, did you ask me to come here because you already have a result?" Shen Yu asked unhurriedly under the 3 pairs of eyes. "You can say that." Count North nodded. He had already found out the truth before today. He delayed until now because he was thinking about how to deal with this matter. Madame Yu was his beloved woman, and Shen Qingran was the son he had high hopes for. He didn't want to leave a stain on the two of them. "I asked you to come here today because I want Madame Yu to apologize to you." "What kind of compensation do you want?" Shen Yu raised his eyebrows. "Father, you want me to turn this matter into a small one?" Madame Yu didn't do it on purpose. Count North sighed. She was also bewitched by someone. "I will give the person who bewitched her to you and let you deal with it. Seeing that she didn't make a big mistake, I will let it go this time. You are going to enter the palace soon. At this time, it's not good for negative news to spread in the mansion. This concubine knows she was wrong. This concubine was possessed for a moment and almost harmed eldest Gongzi. This concubine is willing to pray for eldest Gongzi every day. The person that Count North wanted to hand over to Shun Yu to deal with was her most capable maidservant. Madame Ayu's heart was filled with hatred, but she didn't dare to show it on her face. She endured it until her teeth almost shattered. There's no need to pray for blessings. I'm afraid I can't bear it. Shun Yu had a smile on his face, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. What if I say I'm not willing to accept this punishment, Father? Don't be in a hurry to find an excuse to evade me. You and I both know in our hearts whether or not Madame Ayu was bewitched by someone and accidentally committed a mistake. I gave this matter to Father because I trusted Father. Now it seems that Father doesn't seem to be worthy of my trust. Count North's forehead twitched when he heard this. How come he didn't know when his eldest son became so eloquent and unforgiving? The ugly expression on Madame Ayu's face couldn't be hidden. The alarm bells in her heart kept beating. She had to re-examine the child left behind by the previous wife of Count North. She had always regarded Shun Yu as a stumbling block for her child to inherit the Marquis Fu. She had done her best to prevent the Marquis Fu's only son from obtaining the position of Shizi. This time, when she heard the news that Shun Yu was going to enter the palace, she felt that even the heavens were looking after her. She hadn't even relaxed when the person she placed in Shun Yu's courtyard brought bad news. Fortunately, there was news later that Shun Yu had handed the matter over to Count North to deal with. Madame Ayu secretly laughed at Shun Yu's naivety and turned around to think of an excuse for herself. As expected, Count North was a person who cared a lot about his face. He didn't want to make a big deal out of the matter and followed her excuse to push all the blame onto someone else. Everything went smoothly. Shun Yu didn't have any intention to intervene. Although it was painful to lose a confidant maid, she would definitely find an opportunity to take revenge. She had already lowered her posture. She didn't expect that Shun Yu not only didn't appreciate her kindness, but also didn't have much respect for Count North. Looking at Shun Yu's smiling eyes, Madame Ayu found that she couldn't understand this man who was more than 10 years younger than her. His attitude was casual. Even if Count North was obviously biased towards her, she didn't see even a little bit of anger in his eyes. It was as if he already knew the result. He came here just to go through the motions. What was Shun Yu's purpose? At this moment, Madame Ayu panicked. She thought that the reason Chen Yu trusted Sir Junbei with the drugging was because of his trust and admiration for her father. But now, it seemed that it wasn't like that at all. The reason he handed the matter over was because he didn't care. He didn't care about the matter of the medicine being tampered with. Not to mention Sir Junbei, he didn't even care about the entire manor. Count North. Madame Ayu couldn't help but take a step back and grab Count North's sleeve. She looked at Shun Yu with fear in her eyes. Noticing Madame Ayu's frightened eyes, Shun Yu pulled the corners of his mouth up. It was really interesting. He hadn't done anything yet, but he scared himself. Look at what you're saying. What happened to all the books you've been reading for so many years? Count North frowned and patted the back of Madame Ayu's hand to comfort her. Madame Ayu is your elder. You can't make up stories. Elder? Shun Yu sneered. Let's not talk about whether or not I'm making things up. She's just a concubine. I'm afraid she can't bear the title of elder. In Da Huan, there was a clear distinction between the legitimate wife and the legitimate son. The status of the legitimate wife and the legitimate son was far higher than that of the concubines and the illegitimate son. It was only because Count North's legitimate wife died early and didn't remarry that Madame Ayu could monopolize the power in the Lord Protector's mansion. But the law was there. No matter how much Count North doted on Madame Ayu, he couldn't make her the legitimate wife. Shun Yu's words pierced Madame Ayu's sore spot. Because she was only a concubine in the beginning, she couldn't shake off the status of a concubine for the rest of her life. Even the children she gave birth to were born inferior to others. As for Shun Yu, she believed that her own child wasn't inferior to Shun Yu in any way. Just because she was born into a good family, her son would never surpass Shun Yu in this lifetime. A dim light flashed through her eyes. When she raised her eyes again, Madame Ayu was already on the verge of tears. It's this concubine's fault. Lord Marquis, please don't cause a rift between you and eldest young master because of this concubine. Since eldest young master is certain that this concubine did it, this concubine will admit it. Don't make things difficult for Lord Marquis. As soon as Madame Ayu's words left her mouth, the anger on Count North's face deepened. You have no respect for your elders. Shen Yu, you're really becoming more and more unruly. You want to kill my elder? Shen Yu retorted without any trace of politeness, or the elder who's harboring the true culprit. Madame Ayu really has good means. With just a few words, you're able to make Lord Marquis speak up for you without distinguishing between right and wrong. Is it true that even if you really succeeded, you can still make Lord Marquis let it go so easily? You're not allowed to speak of mother like that. Shen Qingran finally digested the information with great difficulty. When he heard Shen Yu's words, he couldn't help but speak up. You don't have the right to speak here. Shen Yu coldly glanced at Shen Qingran. Also, other than the wife of the main house, the concubines can only call her Yinyang. Next time, don't call her by the wrong name. Meeting Shen Yu's cold gaze, Shen Qingran shuddered. He mumbled a few words and didn't dare to speak again. Shen Yu found a chair and sat down. He unhurriedly arranged his cuffs. Let's get back to the topic. Lord Marquis doesn't want the news of Lord Marquis inciting his concubines to commit murder to become the topic of discussion before I enter the palace, right? Count North finally realized that Shen Yu wasn't someone he could easily manipulate. Unfortunately, in a few days, Shen Yu was going to enter the palace. He didn't want that person to blame him. Not only could he not do anything, but he also had to properly worship him. He could only suppress his anger and ask, "What exactly do you want?" It would have been better if father had been so tactful earlier. Why did you have to make things so ugly? Shen Yu pulled down his sleeve. Since Ayu Furen is so easily confused and makes mistakes, it will be difficult for her to manage such a large Marquis Fu. Father should choose someone else. Count North Marquis didn't remarry, but there were many concubines in the Fu. It was just that Ayu Furen's family had always been the most powerful. Now that Ayu Furen had fallen, the Huyuan of the Marquis Fu would be very lively. Also, even though my mother is no longer here, I still don't want anyone to act in her name. Before father remarries, the Marquis Fu can only have one Furen. That is my mother. Father, do you understand? If father wants a new Furen, wait until I enter the palace, I will mention it to His Majesty. So ruthless. Ayu Furen stumbled. She never thought that this silent Di son of the Marquis Fu would be so powerful. With just a few words, he made her 10 years of hard work in the Marquis Fu go up in smoke. Without the power to manage the household, without the title of Ayu Furen, what difference was there between her and the other concubines in the Marquis Fu? So he was waiting for her here. Ayu Furen looked at the man she had loved for half her life, the hope in her eyes almost overflowing. What does father think? What else could he do? Count North Marquis had no other choice. He avoided Ayu Furen's gaze. Father's marriage doesn't need you to worry about it. This meant that he agreed to Shen Yu's request. Ayu Furen's body softened. She blankly raised her head and happened to meet Shen Yu's meaningful gaze. She suddenly felt that today's matter might just be the beginning. In the imperial study, a man with a jade-like complexion was wearing the imperial robes. He half supported his head as he listened to the eunuch report the news presented by the spy. After the head eunuch Meng Chang finished reading the letter, he couldn't help but laugh. The young master of Count North Marquis's family is quite interesting. The man softly said, he is very noisy. There wasn't the slightest hint of displeasure in his tone. Eunuch Meng understood and said, when the young master comes, the palace will be much more lively. The man indifferently responded. After reading for a while, Eunuch Meng suddenly stopped. Oh, this. The emperor opened his eyes. What? Eunuch Meng hesitated and handed the secret letter in his hand to the man. The man took it and skimmed through 10 lines at a glance. His expression became subtle. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Reading Website, mbk50. cc. Chapter 4. Zhenbei who did what he said. Since that day, Madame Ayu's privileges were taken back one by one. The other concubines vaguely heard the news and did not dare to get close to Shen Yu. Shen Yu was very satisfied with the last few days in the Hu Fu. The only accident was that 3 days before entering the palace issued a decree to confer Shenyu the title of noble lord. This had never happened before in his previous life. Shenyu calmly received the decree in the eyes of gratification, envy, jealousy, and resentment. The eunuch who announced the decree wanted to please him and said a lot of pleasing words. "Marquis, you've really brought up a good son. This blessing is yet to come." Da Huan was popular in the south. There was a system of titles for men after entering the palace. Under the empress, the highest position was noble lord. In the eyes of others, the legitimate son of Zhenbei who could be said to have reached the sky in one step. Zhenbei who smiled proudly on the surface, but in his heart, he could not smile. If before Madame Ayu's incident, he received the news that his legitimate son had received the honor before entering the palace, who knows how happy he would be. But now, his heart was more worried. Shenyu's attitude was too unpredictable. Along with the imperial decree, there were various rewards from the palace. Zhenbei Hufu did not have a proper wife, so all the rewards were sent to Shenyu's courtyard. Shenyu received the decree and came back. Looking at the big and small boxes in the courtyard, he was silent. A eunuch came with a list. His Majesty said that all the things on this list will be handed over to young Master Shen. Shenyu casually opened a box and a huge pearl came into view. He paused and opened the other boxes. Without exception, they were all rare treasures. Looking at the list from the eunuch, his eyes unconsciously overflowed with a little smile. But he did not know that the young emperor who would be cursed by the people in the future because of adultery was such a rich master. Shenyu did not look at the rest of the boxes. He instructed the servants to move the boxes to the small storeroom. He began to think. Did Shen Qingran also receive so many rewards in his previous life? Shenyu did not remember such a thing happening, whether it was in his memory of his previous life or the book he read after his death. When Shen Qingran entered the palace, he did not receive the title of noble lord, nor did he receive any additional rewards. Just because he was the eldest son of Count North Marquis, he could not let the man sitting high on the throne think highly of him. "Young master, it seems that Her Majesty likes you very much." She took off the cloak for her weak and sickly young master, feeling a little happy. The servants around Shen Yu came and went. She was one of the few who stayed. She knew that because her young master held the title of the eldest son of Count North Marquis, he suffered a lot in the mansion. This time, because of Count North Marquis's selfishness, he had to serve the emperor as a man. The current emperor of Da Huan was famous for his war. His temperament was violent and his methods were ruthless. His reputation in the aristocratic families was not good. She had been very worried about Shen Yu's encounter after entering the palace. Now, before entering the palace, she saw that the emperor valued her young master so much. She was relieved. The matter had been settled. She only hoped that her young master's future would be smoother. Shen Yu did not comment. He thought deeply and would not be as simple as she thought. However, the emperor's actions could indeed help him a lot. Not guessing the emperor's thoughts, Shen Yu asked, "How is the manor?" "Everything is arranged according to what you said." The manservant standing to the side answered in a low voice. Shen Yu nodded. He had always doted on his own people. He wiped his hands with a handkerchief and said to Mushi, "I have arranged everything in the manor. When I enter the palace, take my token there. Young master, Nubi will not leave." Without waiting for Shen Yu to finish speaking, Mushi knelt down. "Nubi is all alone. Young master is Nubi's only family. Nubi does not want to leave." Mushi's voice was not loud, but her attitude was firm. She knew that this was the escape route that her young master had arranged for her, but she was unwilling. Young master enters the palace. How can he not have a familiar person by his side? Shen Yu looked at the person kneeling below and knew that she had made up her mind. He did not try to persuade her. "I know. Get up." How could Shen Yu not consider what Mushi was thinking? Over the years, he had cultivated a lot of useful subordinates, but the palace was not like other places. He was destined not to bring these people in. However, this was not a big deal. Naturally, there was a use for them to stay outside. After giving the corresponding instructions, Shen Yu waved his hand to let the people leave. She helped the people change into their pajamas. Once again, she raised her head to look at Shen Yu. She wanted to say something but hesitated. Shen Yu lay comfortably on the bed. Ask whatever you want. Young master, why did you cancel the plan? She struggled for a moment but still asked. She was not the only one who wanted to know this question. The people who were arranged to be in the manor also wanted to know. Shen Yu knew that they would want to ask this question for a long time. After all, when the palace issued the decree, his resistance did not seem to be fake. The people who followed Shen Yu all knew that he wanted to get the power of the Count of Zhenbei's mansion. It should belong to him. There was no reason for others to take advantage of it. However, Shen Yu fainted too suddenly and did not leave any clues. His people did not dare to act rashly. They could only wait for Shen Yu to wake up. Who knew that Shen Yu, who woke up, was abnormal. He no longer resisted the idea of entering the palace. The master did not say anything, so the subordinates could only bide their time. Later, the master took action. However, it was not to avoid entering the palace, but to change the plan. He settled the subordinates down and planned to enter the palace alone. Regarding this development, everyone was at a loss. She had been asked this question countless times, both openly and secretly. Did they send you here to ask? Shen Yu thought for a moment and roughly guessed what had happened. I'm also very curious. She did not deny it. I'm tired of staying in the Count of Zhenbei's mansion. It's good to live in another place. Shen Yu's voice was as usual, as if he was not the one whose official career was cut off and could only stay in the harem. She was anxious, but you don't have to follow the wishes of those people. Shen Yu slightly hooked up his lips. Do you think the current development is really what those people want? Thinking of Madame Ayu's end, she was silent. Well, don't think too much. I naturally have my reasons for doing this. After comforting the worried maid, Shen Yu's eyes darkened. He entered the palace because he found clues related to his mother in the palace in his previous life. Shen Yu, the wife of Count of Zhenbei, was a short-lived woman. In addition to leaving her son, Shen Yu, there was nothing else related to her in the world. Shen Yu did not have any feelings for his mother, who he had never met before. He just wanted to find out something. Closing his eyes, he seemed to return to the rainy night in his previous life. A vague voice came through the rain. Are you sure about this news? Destiny. Destiny. Imperial Palace. Shen Yu rubbed his forehead, only to feel a fishy sweetness in his throat. Cough. 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 Gongzi. Gongzi. Something was knocked over, making a loud bang sound. Shen Yu leaned on the bed, his vision turned black. Someone come, call a doctor. Before he could say anything, Shen Yu fell into darkness. When he woke up, it was already noon of the next day. As soon as Shen Yu moved, the maid beside him found out and hurriedly got up. Not long after, the doctor came in. Behind the doctor were Count of Zhenbei and a strange man. Shen Yu's whole body was weak, lying on the bed without moving. After the doctor checked his pulse, he was taken away by a servant. Shen Yu weakly looked at Count of Zhenbei and the strange man, but did not speak. For the first time, Count of Zhenbei saw his eldest son so weak. His delicate face was pale, and his eyelashes were slightly drooping, giving people a feeling that he was weak and in urgent need of protection. He turned his head to the man behind him and cupped his hands. Thank you, Imperial Physician Gu. Imperial Physician Gu returned the salute. It's my duty. Imperial Physician Gu stepped forward to check Shen Yu's pulse. Shen Yu looked at him for a while, then looked away. Imperial Physician Gu Chong, was the youngest and most promising imperial physician since the founding of Da Huan. When he was 27 years old, he became the head of the imperial hospital, but in the same year, he lost his life because of a man-made disaster. Shen Yu remembered him because of a person he met later. Half of that person's face was disfigured, like an evil spirit that crawled out of hell. Only when he talked about Imperial Physician Gu did he have a bit of life. At that time, Shen Yu was in trouble. That person's target of revenge and Shen Yu's target happened to be the same group of forces. The two of them formed a temporary cooperation, but the conditions were not good at that time, so they could only take risks. Their goal was achieved, but that person also died tragically. It was the first time Shen Yu came into contact with such strong feelings. It was also the first time he doubted that he liked Prince Yu. After that, he found the two people's bones and buried them in a beautiful place. He didn't expect to be reborn and meet Imperial Physician Ji Yu so soon. After checking Shen Yu's pulse, Imperial Physician Ji Yu asked someone to bring the original prescription. After thinking for a while, he wrote a new prescription. Young Master Shen's body is too weak. The medicine needs to be adjusted slightly. Will Imperial Physician Ji Yu be responsible for my illness in the future? Shen Yu suddenly asked. Imperial Physician Ji Yu was stunned for a moment, but he quickly answered, "It depends on His Majesty's arrangement." Shen Yu nodded and didn't speak anymore. After resting for 2 days, Shen Yu's body was a little better. It was also the day for him to enter the palace. The emperor understood that he had just recovered from a serious illness, so everything was simplified. Duke Shunbei was not happy, but Shen Yu couldn't ask for more. On that day, Shen Yu saw the man who was bound to him in this life for the first time. The man was wearing a black imperial robe. He was tall, so the heavy imperial robe didn't make him look bloated. Instead, it made him look more imposing. He was indeed somewhat similar to Prince Yu, but he was many times more handsome than Prince Yu. So, how blind was he to like Prince Yu in his previous life? What are you thinking? Shang Junlin looked at the beautiful young man who was staring at him in a daze and slowly walked over. The man's voice was low and sweet. After he deliberately lowered his voice, there was a special taste of tenderness. Shen Yu's ears twitched. He felt a little bewitched. One must enjoy life to the fullest. Such a great beauty was also very pleasing to the eye. I was thinking that His Majesty is more beautiful than I imagined. The last syllable was slightly raised, as if he saw something he liked. No one noticed that the young emperor, who had always been calm, paused his footsteps. "You like me?" Shang Junlin strode over and stood beside the bed. He condescendingly looked at the young man who was sitting on the bed. A sense of oppression poured down. This was a pressure that only belonged to a superior, with a murderous aura that could kill thousands of enemies. The palace servants on the side had already knelt down, trembling. Only Shen Yu's complexion remained unchanged. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading URL, mbk50. cc. Chapter 5. Shang Junlin stared at Shen Yu for a while but did not speak. Without a doubt, Shen Yu was extremely beautiful, otherwise, he would not be famous in the capital for his beauty. His white face looked even more charming in the red dress. At this moment, the beauty in red was sitting on the bed with eyes full of affection, as if only she, who was standing in front of him, could enter his eyes and his heart. No one could not be moved. The surrounding air pressure was getting lower and lower, but Shen Yu did not feel it. He smiled and pulled the hand of the Shang Junlin Emperor. "Your Majesty, it's time to sleep." Hearing the movement, the palace servants lowered their heads more and more. Even eunuch Meng, who had been serving the emperor, did not dare to look up. He could only sigh in his heart. This young master of the Shen family is really bold. Shang Junlin has been on the throne for more than 10 years. After leading the Iron Cavalry to recapture the country, he became more and more ruthless. There were even rumors that the current emperor killed his father and brother. Of course, under the suppression of bloody force, these rumors could only be spread in private. Shen Yu glanced at the trembling palace servant. His hand had already touched the other parties. In both of his lives, he had never seen this person's beauty. Shen Yu wanted to test him, so he lightly touched him and was ready to withdraw. He did not expect that the other party would hold his hand. Shen Yu struggled but failed to break free. He looked at the Shang Junlin doubtfully. "Didn't you say to sleep?" Shang Junlin waved his hand. "You can leave first." The red candle burned. In the blink of an eye, only 2 people, one sitting and one standing, were left in the room. Being stared at by the Shang Junlin Emperor, Shen Yu could not help but feel a little flustered. This person is not serious, right? I came to the palace for this person's beauty, not to put myself in danger. After a moment, Shang Junlin suddenly leaned over. Shun Yu was startled and stepped back. Shang Junlin paused. It seems that the rumors are not true. The eldest son of the Duke of Zhunbei is not a gentleman. The eldest son of Count Zhunbei, Shun Yu, was a handsome and elegant gentleman. He was an unattainable figure in the hearts of countless people. Now that he was in front of him, Shang Junlin realized how wrong the rumors were. Shun Yu thought for a while before remembering that he wasn't the sycophantic minister that everyone would talk about 10 years later. Before he got involved with Shang Junyu, his reputation was still very good. More or less, he missed it. Shun Yu glanced at him. After confirming that he wasn't sexually aroused, he heaved a sigh of relief. Then, does your majesty like the current me, or the me in the rumors? Shang Junlin didn't answer this question. He carefully looked at Shun Yu's face. The rumors weren't completely false. At least about Shun Yu's appearance, it was very accurate. Letting go of Shun Yu's hand, Shang Junlin took a step back and said, I feel that Shun Guojuan's skin is really thick. Shun Yu smiled and said, as long as your majesty likes me, it doesn't matter if I'm thick-skinned. Shang Junlin didn't comment. He raised his arms and said, didn't you say you want to sleep? Help me change my clothes. Your majesty, aren't you going to call the palace servants in? Shun Yu wanted to test Shang Junlin's bottom line again, so he didn't move. This is your duty. Shang Junlin said indifferently. I understand. I have to do this myself. Shun Yu got up from the bed. When he got out of bed, he suddenly felt dizzy and fell down. The expected intimate contact with the floor didn't happen. Shun Yu fell into a hard and warm embrace. Shang Junlin quickly caught him and said, what's wrong? You keep saying that you like me, but you're not even willing to help me undress. Shun Yu didn't answer and fainted. What awaited him was not recovery, but wave after wave of pain, which was getting more and more intense. Shun Yu closed his eyes and resisted the waves of pain. In the cold winter weather, fine beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. His face was getting paler and paler. He unconsciously bit his lower lip and didn't even feel the blood. Shun Yu knew his own body well. He had been sick for decades. Even the most difficult times had never been like this. The pain came fiercely, as if it was going to drown him. In the endless pain, he couldn't feel anything outside. His hand clenched the black cloth, and his clenched teeth were forced open by a big hand. He didn't know how much time had passed, or maybe it was just a moment, but Shun Yu reluctantly regained consciousness. Meng Chang, Imperial Physician Xian. In a daze, Shun Yu seemed to feel the arm holding him tighten. The beauty in red was lying in the arm, pale and weak. She was no longer as lively as before. The Emperor in black looked at him expressionlessly, and his eyes were deep. Eunuch Meng stood aside and didn't dare to breathe. He was called in by the Emperor's angry voice. He thought that young Master Shun had made the Emperor unhappy, but he found out that it wasn't the case. The Imperial physicians came late, and the head was Imperial Physician Ji. You don't have to pay your respects. Come and see him. Imperial Physician Ji felt the pulse and came to the same conclusion as last time. You're weak because you were born in your mother's womb. You can only rest well. Forgive me for not learning the cure. I understand. Shun Yu woke up at noon the next day. When he woke up, Shang Junlin was no longer here. Mu Shi brought the medicine over. The little girl's eyes were red. She must have cried. Shun Yu drank the medicine and got out of bed despite Mu Shi's protests. The pain came and went quickly. Except for a little weakness, Shun Yu didn't feel any other discomfort. Yesterday, Shun Yu was in a hurry. Today, he had time to look at the place where he would live in the future. Yuzhang Palace was the largest palace in the harem. The buildings were gorgeous and the scenery was pleasant. It was also close to the emperor's bedroom. Shun Yu listened to the palace servants as he walked. Yuzhang Palace wasn't built for a long time, but it cost a lot of money. Yuzhang Palace was built by an emperor of Dahuan for his beloved. Since then, Yuzhang Palace was sealed until Shun Yu entered the palace. The palace servants wanted to please Shun Yu. It can be seen that His Majesty really cares about you. When His Majesty left this morning, he specifically told us not to disturb you. Shun Yu beat around the bush and found out from the palace servants that his illness last night had not been announced. Other than eunuch Meng, imperial physician Ji Yu, and a few other insiders, everyone else thought that His Majesty had spent the night in Yuzhong Palace. That night, Shang Junlin came to Yuzhong Palace again. He was just in time for Shun Yu's dinner. Shun Yu's body was weak. Since he was young, he followed the principle of eating less and more. Yuzhong Palace had a small kitchen. Shun Yu never forced himself to eat, sleep, and shelter. Naturally, he followed his habits. "Does Your Majesty want to eat together?" Shang Junlin nodded and sat down. "Thank you for your compassion last night. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to get up today," Shun Yu deliberately said ambiguously. He lowered his eyes and pretended to be shy. Shang Junlin paused in his action of picking food. He slowly ate and said, "It's good that you know that I sympathize with you. Your Majesty is brave. In the future, I hope that Your Majesty can." Shang Junlin interrupted him faintly, "Eat." Shun Yu. "Oh." Eunuch Meng barely controlled the expression on his face. He looked around and saw that the palace servants were all lowering their heads and blushing. If he didn't know the real situation last night, he would have thought that the two masters were very intense. In the evening, Shang Junlin stayed in Yuzhong Palace again. The bedding had been changed to light colors according to Shun Yu's preferences. This time, Shang Junlin didn't let Shun Yu help him undress. He took a bath and changed into a set of pajamas. Seeing Shang Junlin come in, Shun Yu moved closer to the bed and said, "Your Majesty, come here quickly." The man in pajamas was much more approachable than when he wore the black imperial robe. Shun Yu became bolder. After dismissing the palace servants, Shang Junlin walked over and said, "From today onwards, I will let imperial physician Ji Yu take care of your health." Shang Junlin didn't want last night's incident to happen again. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Shun Yu's small face rubbed against the quilt. "Your Majesty is so kind. You are a smart person. I believe there are some things that I don't need to say." Shun Yu nodded. When they looked at each other, they reached a consensus. Feeling the warmth from the other side of the bed, Shun Yu closed his eyes. The emperor who would live with him for a while seemed to be easier to fool than he thought. Interesting. For a few days, Shang Junlin stayed in Yuzhong Palace. The news about how Shun Yu was favored spread like wings. Shun Yu's life was peaceful here, but there were a lot of storms outside because of him. Shun Yu's favor surprised many people who were not optimistic about this matter. The people who originally ridiculed Duke Zhenbei for sending his legitimate son into the palace immediately changed their attitude and complimented him as if they didn't need money. There were also many people who were jealous and insinuated that Shun Yu had seduced the emperor. There were also many people who secretly had some thoughts. Since there was one Shun Yu, would there be a second or third one? They didn't say this before, but now that Shun Yu was a living example, the bold people were ready to send people to the harem. Duke Zhenbei had been in the limelight recently because of Shun Yu. On one hand, he was happy that Shun Yu was favored, but on the other hand, he was frightened by Shun Yu's attitude. In comparison, concubine Yu and her son could only be frightened. Especially Shen Qingran. He couldn't help but think, if he was the one who entered the palace, would he be the one favored now? The decline of concubine Yu's status had more or less affected Shen Qingran. The people in the harem of Duke Zhenbei's mansion knew clearly how Shun Yu entered the palace, so they used this matter to mock Shen Qingran and concubine Yu. Under concubine Yu's coaxing and pestering, Duke Zhenbei's attitude softened. It was not easy to see the light, but because of the news that Shun Yu was favored, concubine Yu's heart was filled with hatred. All kinds of movements were passed to Shun Yu's ears. "How can they say that about you? She was dissatisfied. You obviously didn't do anything. How can you say that you seduced the emperor? What a vixen." She really couldn't say the last few words. Even if she didn't say it, Shun Yu also knew what the people outside would say about him, not to mention that this was just the beginning. There were still several forces who hadn't taken action. Shun Yu hooked his lips and smiled. "Since they say that I seduced the emperor, I might as well let them feel it." She silently lowered her head. She felt that her master's smile had a bit of the temperament of a demon concubine. Shun Yu brought the soup from the small kitchen to the imperial study. Seeing him, Eunuch Meng wiped his sweat and greeted him. "Why did Gui Jun come?" "I'm here to deliver soup to His Majesty." "Is it convenient for His Majesty now?" "Gui Jun, please wait a moment. Let this servant go and report." Not long after, Eunuch Meng came out and brought Shen Yu in. After Shen Yu entered, Eunuch Meng bowed his head and retreated. The imperial study was silent. Shen Yu didn't have time to look around before he heard Shang Junlin's voice. "Shen Yu." Looking towards the direction of the voice, Shen Yu's pupils shrank. He saw a glaring red and the emperor in black in the middle of the red. The strong smell of blood filled the tip of his nose. There was a person lying in a pool of blood at the man's feet. He didn't know whether he was dead or alive. The other person was curled up and kneeling not far away, not daring to raise his head. Shang Junlin's ink-black eyes were rolling. He reached out to him and said, "Genius, 1 second, remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Website, mbk50. CC. Chapter 6. Shen Yu did not speak. He stared blankly, as if he was frightened. The temperature in the room was as cold as the wind. The man kneeling on the ground kept his head down and tried his best not to lose his composure on the spot. Shang Junlin looked at Shen Yu silently. The darkness in his eyes was getting thicker. A low pressure pressed on him, silently urging him to walk over. Shen Yu took 2 steps forward and stopped a few steps away from the pool of blood. He could feel a strong sense of presence on him. The atmosphere in the imperial study was extremely tense. If Shen Yu was timid, he would have collapsed on the ground. "Your clothes will get dirty. Your Majesty, why don't you come over to my side?" The man who was about to explode was stunned. The air around him froze. Even the man kneeling on the side could not help but raise his head. Shang Junlin casually glanced at him. The man was so scared that he immediately lowered his head and did not dare to be presumptuous. "Heh!" Shang Junlin suddenly laughed. "You sure have guts." Shen Yu met Shang Junlin's gaze squarely. Shen Yu couldn't see through what Shang Junlin was thinking. He only felt that the other party's mood seemed to have improved. Shang Junlin threw the handkerchief that he used to wipe his hands into the pool of blood. The white handkerchief was instantly dyed red. He did not even look at it and strode towards Shen Yu. Shen Yu stood in place and watched the black-clothed king walk towards him. With every step, the other party's hostility dissipated. When he stood in front of him, the black-clothed king's momentum was completely restrained. Shen Yu raised the food box in his hand. "I brought soup for your Majesty. Would your Majesty like to have some?" He did not ask why such a scene appeared in the imperial study. "Are you not afraid?" Shang Junlin asked with interest. There was no fear on Shen Yu's face. It was as if the blood on the ground didn't exist in his eyes. According to Shang Junlin's understanding, Shen Yu shouldn't have seen such a scene before Shen Yu. Shen Yu's expression didn't change at all. Of course, he wasn't afraid. In his previous life, the bloody scenes he had created were far crueler than the ones in front of him. Shen Yu tilted his head and glanced at the man lying in a pool of blood. Then, he slowly shifted his gaze to the kneeling man. Finally, his gaze returned to the man in front of him. The man was almost a head taller than Shen Yu. They were so close that Shen Yu had to look up to see his face. Shen Yu stared into Shang Junlin's eyes and said word by word, "Since he has angered His Majesty, he deserves whatever punishment he gets." Shang Junlin's pupils shrank slightly. He raised his hand and pinched Shen Yu's chin. "I didn't expect His Majesty to side with me so much." The man's tone was calm, without a trace of joy. Shen Yu had been staring at the man's face and didn't miss the instant change of expression on his face. "Your Majesty," Shen Yu reached out and grabbed the man's hand that was pinching his chin. "I am His Majesty's man. Naturally, I will side with His Majesty. You'd better remember what you said at all times." Shang Junlin let go of his hand and his expression became gentle. "Didn't you say you brought soup for me? Let me have a taste of His Majesty's cooking." Shen Yu's hand lightened. The food box was taken by Shang Junlin. Then, he felt something warm in his hand. It was held by the man's strong hand. Shen Yu was led by the other party. They walked around the pool of blood and sat in front of the imperial table. Shang Junlin didn't instruct the palace servants. He opened the food box himself. In an instant, the aroma of food floated out and made people salivate. But this aroma mixed with the smell of blood that couldn't be ignored. It was indescribably strange. Shun Yu glanced at the people below. Without Shang Junlin's order, no one dared to move. Seeing that Shang Junlin intended to drink the soup directly, Shun Yu pulled his sleeve. "What's wrong? Are you afraid now?" The man's eyebrows were hidden behind the dense steam and couldn't be seen clearly. "No, Your Majesty, don't you think?" Shun Yu paused for a moment. Eating in this kind of environment is very unappetizing. In some aspects, Shun Yu had a very strange obsession. For example, when he was eating, he didn't like anything that was an eyesore to appear in front of him. As for the people kneeling on the ground and lying in a pool of blood, Shun Yu did not care about how they had angered Shang Junlin. The current Shang Junlin was not a tyrant who would willfully kill innocent people a few years later. What he did had a certain reason, and he did not intend to get involved in the matters of the imperial court. Shang Junlin didn't miss the look of disdain that flashed across Shun Yu's face. He paused and put the bowl back on the table. He said lightly, "Meng Chang." The door of the imperial study opened with a creak. Warm light shone through the door. Eunuch Meng brought in a few men who were dressed in black. These men wore masks on their faces. Only their eyes were exposed. Shun Yu had never seen people dressed like this before. He curiously looked at them a few more times. These people moved quickly, but they didn't have a strong presence. In less than 15 minutes, the imperial study returned to normal. Even the people who were kneeling on the ground were dragged out with their mouths covered. They didn't make a single sound throughout the whole process. Looking at how familiar they were with their movements, it seemed like they had done this many times. "These are the hidden dragon guards." The sudden voice pulled Shun Yu back from his thoughts. He came back to his senses and found that the black-clothed king was looking at him with an unknown expression. The hidden dragon guards. Shun Yu had heard of the existence of this secret troop in his previous life. They were the sharpest knife in the hands of the imperial family. They were also the most loyal force. Other than the current emperor, no one could order them around. Shun Yu had dealt with them in his previous life. He knew how terrifying their strength was. They were definitely a formidable opponent. Shang Junyu had suffered many losses in their hands. In this life, he probably wouldn't go up against them. It's been cleaned up. "Can we have our meal now?" Without waiting for Shun Yu to say anything, Shang Junlin had already retracted his gaze. He picked up the bowl of soup and took a sip. A faint smile appeared on his face. Shun Yu accompanied Shang Junlin to have his meal. He only left when he had enough of his presence. For the entire afternoon, Shang Junlin's mood was much better. Not long after, the emperor's reward came down. All kinds of treasures were sent to Yuzhong Palace. The news also spread outside the palace under Shang Junlin's tacit consent. Just as Shun Yu had expected, after an afternoon, the news about how he was favored spread once again. Not many people cared about the other things that happened in the imperial study. A few people would die in the imperial palace every once in a while. They had already become accustomed to it from their initial fear. Power and money were undoubtedly exciting. With Shun Yu as a good example, those who had ulterior motives couldn't hold back anymore. If they succeeded, what awaited them was a great road to heaven. Duke Zhao's residence. Duke Zhao summoned his son and confidant to discuss in the study. "Father, this is an opportunity. Now there's only one person in the harem, and he's a man who can't have children. If our family's girl enters the palace and gives birth to a son or a daughter, maybe in the future." Duke Zhao's second son pointed to the sky. He didn't say what he wanted to say. "Second young master is right. This matter shouldn't be delayed. It's best to seize the opportunity." One of the confidant also agreed. "This matter must be planned carefully. We can't annoy His Majesty because of this. Otherwise, the gains won't make up for the losses." Similar words happened in the mansions of many officials and nobles. Before Shun Yu, Shang Junlin had never relented on the matter of the harem. Even if they wanted to send their girls into the palace, they had no chance. Now it was different. After tasting it, His Majesty wouldn't refuse beauties to enter the palace. In order to gain His Majesty's favor as soon as possible, some families even prepared beautiful men. Since His Majesty was interested in Shen Gui-jun, he might be interested in other men. All kinds of turmoil inside and outside the palace didn't affect Shen Yu. After sleeping, Shen Yu found out what had happened in the imperial study that day. It turned out that someone had reached into the palace and wanted to use the information he had obtained for profit. Shang Junlin was too lazy to deal with these people and directly killed them. Shang Junlin acted quickly and didn't give anyone a chance. He followed the clues and found the culprit. Without any explanation, he put the culprit in prison. Except for a few people who saw the truth, most people didn't know what had happened. Seeing that Shang Junlin suddenly attacked a family with a good reputation, they were frightened and couldn't help but feel a chill in their hearts. Some people who had a good relationship with that family pleaded for mercy during the court. The young emperor looked at them coldly and didn't say a word. "Your Majesty, Imperial Censor Zhong has always been fair and strict. Your Majesty, please give him a way out. Your Majesty, please give him a way out. Since you all think that Imperial Censor Zhong didn't do anything wrong, then do you all think that I was wrong? I don't dare. I think that you all are very daring. Whoever pleads for mercy will be sent to prison to accompany Imperial Censor Zhong. I believe that Imperial Censor Zhong will be very grateful for your sympathy." As soon as he finished speaking, the hall suddenly quieted down. Some people who had pleaded for mercy began to retreat. The ministers all knew that the emperor wasn't joking. If someone continued to plead for mercy, they would really be sent to prison. This kind of situation had happened more than once. A few people looked at each other and stepped forward. Obviously, they didn't intend to retreat. When Shen Yu received the news, it was already a day later. Because His Majesty was in a bad mood, the palace was jittery and everyone was in danger. The atmosphere in Yuzhong Palace was also a bit dispirited. "Young master." Mu Shi looked worried. She was close to His Majesty and knew more inside information than the palace people. Outsiders said that His Majesty was favored, but only she knew that the truth was not so. Were the three officials really sent to prison because they pleaded for mercy? Shen Yu fiddled with the string of beads and asked. Yes, before the morning court ended, His Majesty sent people to drag them away. Shen Yu fell silent. Imperial Censor Zhong's incident also happened in his previous life, but it happened much later than now. Although Imperial Censor Zhong looked honest on the surface, he did a lot of things behind the scenes. He bought and sold official titles, occupied fertile land, and allowed his children to commit crimes. It was just that he hid it well and dealt with the aftermath well, so no one knew. Shang Junlin arrested people but didn't announce their crimes, allowing others to misunderstand. Did he really not know or, grabbing a hot water bottle in his hand, Shen Yu stood up and said, "Let's go out for a walk." Mu Shi took a cloak and put it on Shen Yu. The two of them led a few palace people out of Yuzhong Palace. "You still want to climb up the branch and become a phoenix? Why don't you take a look at yourself? Hey, who are you trying to seduce by dressing like this? Your master has been sent to prison. What are you so proud of?" The noise came from not far away. The palace people were about to go forward and scold them, but they were stopped by Shen Yu. Shen Yu was at a corner, so he could see the scene not far away. Several palace people were surrounding a thinly dressed woman, punching and kicking her, and taunting her. The woman lowered her head, and her face was covered by her hair. Her hands were clenched tightly by her side, and she endured the malice coming from all around her. Shen Yu deliberately made some noise so that his group was quickly discovered. The palace people quickly knelt down to greet him. When Shen Yu approached, a gust of wind blew, and the woman's face was exposed. Shen Yu stopped in his tracks. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading Website, mbk50. CC. Chapter 7. Not only Shen Yu, but Mu Shi, who was following behind Shen Yu, was also shocked. Shen Yu took after his mother. Even among the other children of the Count of Zhunbei's residence, There was no woman who looked so similar to him. Shun Yu didn't intend to care about the grievances of the palace people, but after seeing the woman's appearance, he couldn't just stay out of it. Whether it was intentional or accidental, he had to come to a conclusion. As the sky gradually darkened, Shun Yu simply asked the palace people to take these people back to Yuzhong Palace. On the way, Mu Shi reported the information she had gathered to Shun Yu. Mu Shi, that woman is called Shun Yu. She was sold into the palace when she was young. She is reclusive and doesn't like to communicate with others. Several senior palace maids saw her outstanding appearance and liked to bully her both openly and secretly. Some time ago, Shun Yu got an opportunity from somewhere and changed her usual low-key attitude. She began to walk around the palace wearing beautiful dresses, and the jewelry she wore became more and more exquisite day by day. Shun Yu. Is her real name Shun Yu? Mu Shi, this servant has asked. She has used this name since she entered the palace. Also, she seems to be involved with a certain force outside the palace. On the 15th of every month, she will avoid people and go to the northwest gate. That place is very remote and not many people go there. Mu Shi was specially trained by Shun Yu and was very talented in gathering information. After Shun Yu entered the palace, there were not many people who could be used, and Mu Shi was one of them. Shun Yu, before today, has something similar happened? Mu Shi, yes, it can even be said to be a common occurrence. After His Majesty ascended the throne, the harem has been in a state of being without a master. Except for the palace people who don't dare to provoke His Majesty, at other times, they are very presumptuous. Shun Yu could understand. The Great Huan Imperial Palace was so big, and the previous emperor was unreliable. The Imperial Palace was the place with the most power struggles, so it wasn't strange for things to happen in secret. If it weren't for Shun Yu's whim, no noble would have set foot in such a remote place. In such a big palace, there were many places like this. Mu Shi continued, however, this palace maid called Shun Yu, in the past, everyone only isolated her and didn't do anything to her. This time, I don't know what angered them, so they tricked her to a remote place to teach her a lesson. After returning to Yuzhong Palace, Shun Yu basically understood what had happened. Speaking of which, this matter was related to Shang Junlin. Shang Junlin's bloody methods were not used much on the palace people. The palace people were afraid of him, but after a long time, it was inevitable that they would have some thoughts. At first, it was just small actions, but when they saw that no one cared, their actions became bigger and bigger. Now, they even dared to brazenly spread news outside the palace. In his previous life, there was a shocking and bloody incident in the Imperial Palace. Because the emperor was angry, half of the palace people were slaughtered, and blood flowed like a river. During that time, the entire Imperial Palace was soaked in the smell of blood, and the atmosphere in the capital was depressed for a long time. After this incident, more and more people recognized Shang Junlin as a tyrant. In his previous life, Shun Yu returned to his fief with the King of Yu at this time, so he didn't know the actual situation in the capital. Now, it seemed that there was an inside story behind this massacre. Shun Yu was half leaning on the chaise lounge. The palace people who were brought back, including that woman, were all kneeling in the main hall. No one dared to say anything. Everyone knew that the Imperial Palace welcomed a new master who was very favored by the emperor. However, this emperor's health was not good, so his range of activities was basically in Yuzhong Palace. Except for the people in Yuzhong Palace, the other palace people didn't have much substantive feelings about Shun Yu's arrival. Tell me, why did you bully this palace maid? Although he understood the general situation, some things still needed to be said by them personally. Your Highness, please forgive us. We servants just can't stand Shun Yu's behavior. She's clearly a palace maid, but not only does she not do her job seriously, she even appears in the places that His Majesty must pass by every day. Shun Yu understood. This palace maid wanted to have a chance encounter with the emperor. It would be best if she could be favored by the emperor and be promoted from a palace maid to a master. Who asked Shang Junlin, who didn't have any worldly desires, not only did he have feelings for her, but he also doted on her very much. From time to time, he would send rewards to Yuzhong Palace. Shun Yu dared to say that Shun Yu was not the only one in the palace who had this idea. However, Shun Yu still couldn't figure it out. According to the information that Mushi inquired, Shinyu used to be honest and knew how to protect herself. Why did she suddenly become so ostentatious? Shinyu knocked on the armrest. Shinyu, do you have anything to say? This servant pleads guilty. Shinyu bowed her head, but her eyes were full of unwillingness. She was a time traveler. After dropping out of high school, she had no choice but to work in a factory. However, she relied on her good looks and always made the men in the factory work for her and frame beautiful women. She didn't know why, but when she woke up, she arrived in this world. After understanding the situation from the original owner's memory, Shinyu couldn't help but feel that her opportunity had arrived. Especially when she found out that her face was more than 10 times more beautiful than in her previous life and she was somewhat similar to Shingui-jun, who was currently the emperor's favorite. She was even more determined to walk the path she wanted to take. Coincidentally, 2 days ago, the original owner received an order from someone outside to find a way to get close to the emperor. It would be best if she could become the emperor's woman through her own advantages. That person also sent in a lot of beautiful clothes and jewelry. Shunyu had never seen these things before and was almost fascinated. She couldn't help but fantasize that if she became an imperial concubine, she would have as many of these things as she wanted. The person who contacted the original Shunyu had also promised to help her in the palace. It was a big and round pie. Shunyu didn't know what the original Shunyu was thinking, but she was tempted. Shunyu had also read a lot of time traveler novels. Connecting her own situation, she was more and more sure that she was the main character. Otherwise, which emperor would have an empty harem after a few years of ascension? As for Shunyu, who had just appeared, Shunyu firmly believed that she was the villain that she needed to defeat. Therefore, she dressed up according to the information given by the people outside the palace and frequently appeared in places where the emperor would pass by. Unexpectedly, her luck was not very good. The emperor recently liked to stay overnight in Yuzhong Palace and changed some of his previous habits. She didn't meet him even once. Even though Shunyu helped her out, Shunyu didn't have the slightest bit of gratitude in her heart. She only had a strong sense of jealousy. Although Shunyu was a man, he had a face that could make men and women go crazy. Shunyu boasted that her face was beautiful enough, but compared to Shunyu, it was like a clumsy imitation. A man who looked like this, no wonder he was accepted into the harem by the emperor who didn't like beautiful women. No wonder he could be favored as soon as he entered the palace. Shunyu almost maliciously thought that no matter how beautiful he was still a man and couldn't give birth to a prince. When she was favored, she must destroy his face. Shunyu obviously felt Shunyu's malice. He felt a little strange. He hadn't done anything yet, so why did he have such a big malice towards him? Shunyu thought for a moment and confirmed that no matter if it was in his previous life or this life, there was no such person in his memory. Shunyu didn't hide her malice deeply. She stood beside Shunyu, so it could be said that she was the one who faced the malice directly. She frowned and became more and more displeased with this palace maid. Shunyu, Mushi, according to the rules of the palace, how should we deal with these people? Mushi, replying to Gui-jun, according to the rules of the palace, those who maliciously cause trouble should be beaten 20 times. In such cold weather, who knew if they would still be alive after being beaten 20 times? The palace maid who committed the crime was so scared that her face turned pale. She kowtowed and begged for mercy. I beg Gui-jun to spare my life. I beg Gui-jun to spare my life. Just deal with them according to the rules of the palace. Shunyu casually decided the fate of these people. As for this one, Shunyu's gaze lightly fell on Shunyu, causing the other party to tremble. Take her away for interrogation. You can't do this. Shunyu didn't know where she got the strength to break free from the person who was holding her hostage. Even if you are Gui-jun, you can't restrict my freedom. Oh. Then tell me, what should I do? Shunyu raised his eyebrows. I didn't do anything wrong. You should let me go. How dare you? Who allowed you to be impudent in front of Gui-jun? 1 inch, what's the matter? A dignified and low voice sounded. The palace maids knelt down and saluted. Shunyu also stood up. The young emperor walked in with a cold aura. He looked around and raised his eyebrows slightly. What's going on? I'm dealing with a few disobedient palace maids. Is your majesty done? Because of what happened a few days ago, Shang Junlin was very busy during this period of time. He was almost drowned in all kinds of reports. Compared to those things, how can they be more important than you? Shang Junlin glanced at Eunuch Meng. Eunuch Meng immediately ordered people to clean up the main hall. The moment she saw Shang Junlin, Shen Yu's eyes lit up. It turned out that this was the current emperor. He was more handsome than she had imagined and more in line with the image of the male lead in her mind. But before she could say anything, her mouth was covered and she was dragged out. Her male lead didn't even spare her a glance. Shang Junlin had good eyesight. With just one glance, he could see that the palace maid was similar to Shen Yu in appearance. He also saw the ambition and covetousness in her eyes. Your Majesty, Shen Yu finished explaining what had just happened and continued, there are many strange things about this palace maid. Her clothes, the accessories she wears, her words and actions, they don't seem like a palace maid who was sent to the palace when she was young. Shang Junlin, did you find anything? Shen Yu, not at the moment. But this palace maid will regularly send news to the outside of the palace. It's just that we don't know who she is contacting. Shang Junlin, I will send someone to investigate. After the two finished their meal, a palace maid came to report that Shen Yu was making a fuss about wanting to see the emperor. Shen Yu and Shang Junlin looked at each other. Let's go and see. Shen Yu was quite curious about what had happened to Shen Yu. He had a faint guess in his heart that he needed to verify. Before he arrived, he heard Shen Yu shouting, I have something very important to say to His Majesty. Go and invite His Majesty here. Shen Yu deliberately fell behind Shang Junlin by one step and used his figure to block him. He wanted to listen to what Shen Yu wanted to say. Seeing the emperor, Shen Yu calmed down and bowed politely. Your Majesty, this servant is willing to tell you the person behind this. I hope Your Majesty will believe that this servant is on Your Majesty's side. Then, in one breath, she said the plan of the person behind the scenes without any hesitation. The corner of Shen Yu's mouth twitched. He began to wonder if this person's brain was not very good. After speaking, Shen Yu looked at Shang Junlin expectantly. Suddenly, she saw Shen Yu behind Shang Junlin and said in surprise, Why are you here? Shen Yu walked out slowly and leaned on Shang Junlin. His Majesty can't bear to leave me. Naturally, he had to bring me here. You seem to be very unhappy to see me here. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Website, mbk50. CC. Chapter 8. How could Shen Yu be happy? She regarded Shen Yu as a strong enemy. Seeing Shen Yu being high above and her being reduced to a prisoner, her heart was extremely unbalanced. Her mood fluctuated too much, and her face more or less showed some clues. But now she was in a weak position, so she could only endure this. Biting her lower lip, she said weakly, This servant didn't mean that. Seeing that her words didn't match her heart, Shen Yu didn't care. You said that you have something important to report to His Majesty. His Majesty is already here. If you have something to say, just say it. Shen Yu was unwilling to say it in front of Shen Yu. She intended to use the original owner's secret to exchange for her future. With Shen Yu here, she didn't know how to obstruct her. This is a serious matter. Can His Majesty alone? Presumptuous. How can His Majesty's schedule be controlled by a guilty slave like you? Before Shen Yu finished speaking, the palace servant who was waiting on the side sternly scolded. Shen Yu was scared and trembled. She lowered her head and didn't dare to speak. After a while, she secretly raised her head and looked in the direction of the emperor. With just a glance, she almost broke her teeth. The young and handsome emperor was holding a gorgeously dressed young man in his arms and whispering to him. His face was completely different from when he was facing her. Jealousy and hatred welled up in her heart. Shen Yu spoke without thinking, Let him out. Otherwise, I won't say it. Shen Yu's voice paused. She began to doubt the correctness of her guess. Was the person from that place so stupid? She didn't see Shen Qingran being so stupid. Shang Junlin's face became cold. According to his previous style, he would kill anyone who was suspicious. If Shen Yu hadn't hinted that there was something fishy about this woman, he wouldn't have come here. Holding Shen Yu's shoulder, Shang Junlin said lightly, "If you don't want to say it, kill her." Shen Yu looked at the back of the two people who left. She was dumbfounded. It wasn't that she didn't want to say it. She just didn't want to lower her head in front of Shen Yu. A palace servant approached. Shen Yu hurriedly said, "Your Majesty, Your Majesty, I'll talk. Don't kill me." One at this moment, Shen Yu started to panic. She finally realized what kind of place she had transmigrated to. This was the Imperial Palace. She was facing the Emperor, who was above everyone else. She was just a palace maid, while her opponent was the ruler of a country who held the power of life and death. Fear welled up in Shen Yu's heart. Only then did he realize how bold his actions were. "Your Majesty, don't you want to listen?" Shen Yu asked in a low voice when he felt the force on his shoulder. Shang Junlin was uninterested. "Meng Chang will report the results. If you want to know, you can just read the report." Shen Yu thought about it and agreed. Besides, it was inconvenient for him to ask the question that he wanted to verify in front of so many people. The two of them left together. This time, Shen Yu was very obedient. He answered all the questions that were asked, and it didn't take long for him to reveal all the information that the original owner knew. "Your Majesty, can you spare Shen Yu's life?" After returning to the palace, Shen Yu took off his cloak and asked. Shang Junlin also changed into his regular clothes with the help of the palace servants. "What? Are you interested?" Shen Yu touched his face. "I'm just curious. How can there be someone in the Imperial Palace who looks like me?" This reason was irrefutable. Shang Junlin knew about Shen Yu's background. He nodded. "As you wish. Your Majesty is so kind." Shen Yu looked at Shang Junlin with smiling eyes. Her eyes seemed to be filled with stars. Shen Yu often said this sentence. For some reason, Shang Junlin wanted to touch those starry eyes. He suppressed the sudden desire and said, "Rest." Imperial physician Ji Yu was specially allowed by Shang Junlin to nurse Shen Yu's body. Every other morning, he would come to Yuzhong Palace to check Shen Yu's pulse. After checking Shen Yu's pulse as usual, Imperial physician Ji Yu asked about Shen Yu's recent condition. Shen Yu answered all of his questions. When he was about to leave, Shen Yu called him. "Imperial physician Ji Yu. What can I do for you?" "I just want to tell Imperial physician Ji Yu that I have always been a domineering person. Since Imperial physician Ji Yu wants to nurse my body with peace of mind, you can postpone other work." Imperial physician Ji Yu paused and looked at the young man who was half leaning against the bed. The young man was dressed in red, and his skin was as white as snow, like a red plum blooming wantonly in the snow. When he spoke, his expression was indifferent, as if he did not realize how overboard his words were to a doctor. Imperial physician Ji Yu subconsciously wanted to refuse, but he was interrupted by Shen Yu. "Imperial physician Ji Yu, just do as I say. I won't harm my benefactor." Meeting the other party's meaningful gaze, Imperial physician Ji Yu swallowed the words he wanted to say and bowed respectfully. "I will obey." After Imperial physician Ji Yu left, some palace servants were puzzled. "Why did you do this? You are ruining your reputation." Shen Yu smiled but didn't say anything. He just wanted to repay the kindness of his previous life. Moreover, Imperial physician Ji Yu was a good person to get along with. Without the gentle and polite Imperial physician Ji Yu, who would nurse his body? Imperial physician Gu's medical skills were indeed outstanding. After taking a few medicines, Shen Yu felt much better this winter than before. The situation in the court was getting more and more tense. After 3 ministers were sent to prison, no one dared to plead for Imperial physician Zhong. However, this didn't mean that they agreed with the emperor's decision. Undercurrents were surging under the calm surface. All forces were ready to make a move. The emperor sat high up in the imperial court and had a panoramic view of everything. Shen Yu more or less heard some news. Combined with the memories of his previous life, he could roughly guess what would happen next. Some people stretched their hands too far and thought that their actions were flawless. However, they didn't know that there was a pair of eyes recording their actions. Imperial physician Zhong was the first to bear the brunt. However, He was just a bait used by several forces in the game. Shang Junlin caught him at lightning speed and caught the other side by surprise. No one knew who the real winner would be. Shen Yu thought about it. In his previous life, the King of Yu seemed to have said that he gained a lot from this incident. Shen Yu didn't participate in it, so he didn't know the details. The incident broke out after the King of Yu secretly entered the capital. It must be related to the King of Yu. Shen Yu was a vengeful person. Since it was related to the King of Yu, he couldn't just stand by and watch. He didn't care about others, but the King of Yu would never get what he wanted in this life. The imperial palace was calm for the time being, but Shen Yu knew that it wouldn't be long before the storm of the previous court swept into the harem. Sure enough, when Shen Yu woke up early in the morning, he heard stifled cries. Shen Yu, what happened? Mu Shi helped Shen Yu tie up his hair. Last night, several palace servants were dealt with in the palace. Shen Yu, why didn't you tell me? Mu Shi, it was the emperor's order not to disturb your rest. Thinking of the scene last night, Mu Shi's fingers trembled slightly. It was one thing to hear that the emperor was ruthless and bloodthirsty, but it was another completely different feeling to see it with her own eyes. After experiencing last night, Mu Shi clearly understood what kind of person the current emperor was. He was completely different from the usual emperor by Shen Yu's side. The emperor last night was more in line with the rumors: arrogant, ruthless, and ruthless. He didn't need to do it himself. He only needed to raise his head and signal. Whether it was cursing or begging for mercy, they all died in an instant. Noticing Mu Shi's strangeness, Shen Yu slightly narrowed his eyes. You also saw it? Mu Shi. Yes. Shen Yu adjusted to a comfortable position. Tell me what happened last night. During this time, Shang Junlin was relatively busy. He didn't stay in Yuzhong Palace every day like he did in the beginning. Last night, Shang Junlin wasn't there, so Shen Yu listened to the doctor's advice and went to bed early. Thinking of this, Shen Yu frowned. He slept so deeply last night that he didn't wake up even with such a big movement. Recalling the situation last night, Mu Shi couldn't help but shudder. After you fell asleep last night, a pair of mysterious shadow guards took over Yuzhong Palace. All the palace servants were called away and taken to a remote palace. No matter what we asked, no one answered. Not long after we arrived, His Majesty arrived with a group of imperial guards. Later, there was bright red and a nauseating smell of blood. Mu Shi and the other palace servants of Yuzhong Palace stayed together and watched this silent execution in fear. As she continued to recall, Mu Shi's face became pale. She wasn't an inexperienced person, but who could remain calm after seeing such a scene? Mu Shi's state was getting worse and worse, so Shen Yu had to interrupt her. It's okay. I forgot myself. Mu Shi reluctantly came back to her senses. After all, she was a woman with a strong temperament. It didn't take long for her to adjust herself. Did you make a lot of noise when you left last night? Shen Yu was still a little concerned. Not really. Maybe His Majesty didn't want to disturb you, so he didn't make much noise during the whole process. Thinking of the group of people who came and went like ghosts, Mu Shi felt a chill in her heart. This made sense. Imperial physician Gu's new prescription would make people sleep more deeply. If Shang Junlin ordered not to disturb him, it was normal that he didn't notice. Young master, what do you think His Majesty meant? Did he specifically order not to wake the young master because he cared? Shen Yu shook his head. He didn't know what the emperor was thinking. Go back and pacify the people of Yuzhong Palace. Pick some things from the storeroom and reward them. Shen Yu ordered. Yes. You also have a good rest today. Mu Shi was about to say no when she heard Shen Yu continue. Give the people of Yuzhong Palace a holiday. Yes. Shen Yu usually didn't like the palace servants to serve him closely. Mu Shi adjusted the people to change shifts at different times and left the rest of the time for the people to rest. It didn't affect the normal operation of Yuzhong Palace. Thinking of the scene in the previous life where the Prince of Yu complacently said that his reputation was better than the tyrant's, Shen Yu had the intention to make things difficult for the Prince of Yu in this regard. In the future, Shang Junlin's image as a tyrant became more and more deeply rooted in the people's hearts. It was inseparable from the wanton slandering of the Prince of Yu and others. Some people didn't even look at themselves when they slandered others. How could they do better than the other party? After dealing with the court affairs, Shang Junlin hesitated for a moment and still came to Yuzhang Palace. Eunuch Meng followed behind the emperor and said in surprise, Isn't it too quiet? Compared to the past, Yuzhang Palace seemed to be empty all of a sudden. They almost didn't meet many palace servants along the way. The bedchamber was dark. The people brought by Shang Junlin came forward to light the candles, and the palace regained its light. What happened? Shang Junlin looked at the young man sitting at the table who didn't get up to greet him. Where are the servants in the palace? I saw that they were all distracted, so I let them rest. Xinyu still didn't get up. His eyes stayed on the mirror in front of him. As for why they were distracted, Xinyu didn't need to say it. Everyone present could guess it. Eunuch Meng didn't expect that His Majesty would encounter such a thing as soon as he finished his official business and came to Yuzhang Palace. Cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He secretly said, My little ancestor, even if you are dissatisfied with His Majesty's way of doing things, you shouldn't give His Majesty a hard time. Shang Junlin walked a few steps to Xinyu, pinched his chin, turned Xinyu's head to face him, and asked coldly, Are you complaining about me? Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading URL, mbk50. cc. Chapter 9. This time, it wasn't just the palace servants who were stunned. Shang Junlin, who was standing close to Xinyu, could feel that Xinyu really didn't have a trace of fear. Xinyu was trembling, but it wasn't because of fear. Instead, it was as if he had encountered something of interest and was extremely excited. The hand that was pinching Xinyu's chin unconsciously loosened. Xinyu shook his head and complained in a low voice, You're hurting me. Shang Junlin couldn't help but look at the place where he had just pinched. It was already faintly stained with a layer of crimson. Delicate. Unexpectedly, Xinyu saw a faint sense of loss in the man's eyes. A trace of interest flashed through his eyes. He got up and slowly approached Shang Junlin. He leaned close to Shang Junlin's ear and said in a voice that only the two of them could hear, Your Majesty, are you feeling guilty? Shang Junlin grabbed Xinyu's shoulder and stopped him from getting closer. He scolded in a low voice, Xinyu, you're overstepping your boundaries. Your Majesty, please forgive me. Xinyu stood up straight and bowed politely. For some reason, Shang Junlin felt a trace of disappointment when he saw Xinyu like this. He concealed the strange feeling in his heart. He held Xinyu's hand and led him to the bed to sit down. Are you really angry with me? Xinyu, Your Majesty, do you want to hear the truth or a lie? Shang Junlin, I don't like people who lie. Xinyu, the truth is, I'm not angry. Shang Junlin didn't believe him. Your behavior today doesn't seem like you're not angry. Well, in fact, I was a little angry at first. Xinyu stretched out his hand and used his thumb and index finger to make a small distance, just a little bit. But now I'm not angry anymore. Shang Junlin turned Xinyu's head. This time, he paid attention to his strength and didn't hurt Xinyu. He stared into Xinyu's eyes as if he wanted to see through his thoughts. Really? How would I have the guts to lie to Your Majesty? Xinyu asked curiously. Why doesn't Your Majesty want me to know? It's not a big deal to begin with. Shang Junlin turned his head away to avoid Xinyu's focused gaze. The imperial physician said that your body needs to rest. This kind of thing isn't worth bothering you about. So it turned out to be for his body. Xinyu was stunned, and then a warm current surged in his heart. Xinyu grew up with difficulty with a sick body, so he received very little care since he was a child. Whether it was in his previous life or this life, there were very few people who truly cared about him purely because of his poor health. Shang Junlin seemed to have noticed his loss of self-control, so he added, I was also afraid that you would have nightmares at night and disturb my sleep. Don't worry, Your Majesty. With Your Majesty by my side, nothing can scare me. Xinyu didn't expose him. He smiled and leaned in front of the man, leaning his head on the man's shoulder. I finally found out that you are a fearless person. Feeling the weight on his shoulder that didn't belong to him, Shang Junlin smiled slightly. No, I'm afraid that Your Majesty will ignore me. Shen Yu muttered. Without waiting for Shang Junlin to say anything, Shen Yu continued, I know that your majesty is doing this for my own good. I won't blame your majesty for this. Besides, how can some strangers be more important than your majesty? Shang Junlin's grudge completely disappeared. He pointed his index finger at Shen Yu's forehead and took the initiative to mention, that palace maid's confession came out. Do you want to take a look? Shen Yu nodded slightly. Because he was leaning on Shang Junlin's shoulder, every time he nodded, Shang Junlin could feel that his shoulder was gently rubbed against. Meng Chang, bring the confession. Yes. Eunuch Meng was amazed. He admired Shen Yu's approach from the bottom of his heart. He had never seen anyone who could calm His Majesty's anger in such a short time. Not only did this person do it, but he also coaxed His Majesty into a good mood. Although His Majesty didn't have much expression on his face, it wasn't difficult for Eunuch Meng, who was familiar with him, to see that His Majesty was in a good mood now. The confession was quickly presented. Shen Yu leaned on Shang Junlin's shoulder and read it together with him. Perhaps because she was scared, Shen Yu clearly told His Majesty all the information that the original owner knew. While reading, Shen Yu couldn't help but frown. After all, Shen Yu was a peripheral figure. She didn't know much inside information. But from the information she gave, it could be vaguely seen how ambitious the person behind the scenes was. Although Shen Yu already knew that there were spies planted in the palace, he didn't expect this net to be buried so deeply. Shen Yu entered the palace 10 years ago. That was to say, 10 years ago, or even longer ago, these spies had already started planning. What Shen Yu brought out was just the tip of the iceberg. Those who were hiding under the ice and deeper still hadn't revealed their tracks. There were many people like Shen Yu in the palace. Usually, they wouldn't do anything. The person behind the scenes was very cautious. They would only make a move at the most critical moment. After Shang Junlin ascended the throne, he spent more time on the battlefield than in the palace. It was only in the past 2 years that he didn't go to the battlefield frequently because the country was recaptured. After reading the confession, Shen Yu understood why Shang Junlin wanted the palace servants to watch the massacre. On one hand, it was to kill the chicken to warn the monkey. On the other hand, it was to deliberately show the person behind the scenes. He used the bloodiest way to warn the enemy, don't play any dirty tricks in front of him. The names on the list might not be complete, but it didn't matter. After last night, who would dare to make the same mistake again? Moreover, Shang Junlin wasn't in the palace in the past. From now on, he would be here all the time. His control over the palace would be greatly increased. That palace maid only gave a small part of the information. But it's enough. Based on these clues, my men can find out everything I want. Shen Yu was immersed in his own thoughts. Suddenly, he heard Shang Junlin's voice. After a while, he realized that Shang Junlin was explaining to him. He hesitated and said, this confession, it's just a cover-up. A part of it was found out by the hidden dragon guards. Shen Yu understood. This was done to confuse the public. By pushing out Shen Yu, the person behind the scenes wouldn't know how much the emperor knew about their actions. I didn't know that Imperial Censor Zhong had such a long reach. What a coincidence. According to Shen Yu, a part of the information pointed to Imperial Censor Zhong. This Imperial Censor, who appeared to be honest and upright, had done a lot of good deeds behind the scenes. The hidden dragon guards found a lot of evidence based on these clues. Shang Junlin didn't hide anything from Shen Yu and said, I thought that he was just greedy. I didn't expect. Imperial Censor Zhong was born in an aristocratic family. He was one of the few officials who did a good job when the previous emperor was on the throne. His reputation had always been good. After Shang Junlin ascended the throne, he dismissed many officials who didn't do a good job. It was rare for Imperial Censor Zhong to stay. Who would have thought that everything was fake? Your Majesty, do you want to publicize the evidence of Imperial Censor Zhong's crimes? You want me to publicize it? Shang Junlin stared at Shen Yu. I just feel that he has done so many wrong things. He should be scolded by the people. It was too easy for someone like Imperial Censor Zhong to have a good reputation even after his death. Shen Yu said, if a person does something wrong, he should be responsible for his actions. Isn't that right, Your Majesty? Shang Junlin said, Your Majesty, everything you say makes sense. Shin Yu said, Then. Your Majesty, you scared my servant girl. Shouldn't you do something? Shang Junlin didn't expect the topic to suddenly change to this matter. He looked at Shin Yu with a faint smile. Did you plan to ask for a reward for the servant girl you brought into the palace from the beginning? If possible, I hope that Your Majesty can do something to the other palace servants. Sure. Shang Junlin was in a good mood and was happy to fulfill Shin Yu's small request. Meng Chang, do as Your Majesty says. Oh, this servant thanks Your Majesty for your concern. Eunuch Meng smiled and accepted the order. The reward diluted the fear of the palace servants. The King of Yu waited for a few days, but there was no good news from the palace. He was so angry that he smashed his cup. This is the foolproof plan you said? Who said that he wouldn't care about the life and death of the palace servants? 1 inch this. The confidant couldn't say. He also wanted to know why the emperor suddenly changed his mind. The palace servants who received the reward respected the emperor more than they feared him. Their original plan was ruined. Useless things. The King of Yu sighed. Think about it carefully. What strange things have happened to him recently? The King of Yu had some understanding of Shang Junlin. He knew that his imperial brother disdained to explain many things. He didn't care about other people's opinions. This time, comforting the palace servants didn't seem like something he would do. If I have to say, does the newly conferred Shen Guijun count? The King of Yu suddenly grasped the table and his face darkened. When he mentioned Shen Yu, he thought of the fact that he was treated as that person's substitute. However, other people didn't know. I heard that Shen Guijun is very favored. The incident happened in the harem. It's very likely that it has something to do with this person. Don't talk about it. The King of Yu wanted to vomit, but he couldn't show it. It was very uncomfortable. But now, there were more important things to do. We'll talk about this later. Think about how to save young Master He. He didn't forget the most important thing for him to hide his identity and come to the capital. Shin Yu didn't care about what the King of Yu would do. He tidied himself up and planned to find out more about Shin Yu. Shin Yu was locked up in a special secret prison. Normally, Shin Yu couldn't go there. He pestered Shang Junlin for a few days and finally got Shang Junlin to take him there. You said that you can get something different. Don't forget. Outside the secret prison, Shang Junlin reminded him. Shin Yu replied, I know. As long as Your Majesty can give me some time alone with her and make sure that no one is spying on us during that period of time. Shang Junlin said, I'm really curious. What's the big secret that you mentioned? Why was Shin Yu so sure that he could get something that even the hidden dragon guards couldn't get? Shin Yu followed a hidden dragon guard into the secret prison. As the name suggested, the secret prison was dark and cold. The moment he stepped in, he felt like he was in hell. Shin Yu tightened the cloak on his body and saw someone in a single cell. The prison guard opened the cell door and led the people out. Shin Yu. The person who was cowering by the wall heard the movement and looked up. She saw that the person who came was Shin Yu, whom she didn't want to see the most. She was about to say something when he lowered his voice and said a few words. Shin Yu. The next moment, Shin Yu widened her eyes in shock. How could it be? How did Shin Yu know about it? What exactly did he, Genius 1 second remember home address, www.bk50. CC Literature Network Mobile Version Reading Website, MBK50. CC. Chapter 10. The word Shin Yu said was mobile phone. He had accidentally heard it from Shin Qingran in his previous life. It was said that it was a necessary communication device for everyone in that era. Shin Yu had intended to test Shin Yu first, but he didn't expect her to give herself away so easily. This saved him a lot of effort. You also transmigrated from the modern era? Shin Yu asked in surprise. Modern era, transmigration, it matched with Shin Qingran's origin. Shin Yu was happy. He was worried that he couldn't find a way to understand Shin Qingran's origin, and now Shin Yu had delivered herself to his doorstep. It really didn't take any effort at all. Shun Yu had to calm her down before he could ask her what he wanted to know. Shun Yu didn't hesitate to tell him about her original body, so she probably didn't care about her original body. She wasn't stupid, but she still hadn't told him her true origin. When did you? Shun Yu was stunned when she found out that there were other transmigrators in this world besides her. Shish! Shun Yu put his finger to his lips and interrupted Shun Yu. Shun Yu hurriedly covered her mouth. Seeing that there was no one around, she felt relieved. She staggered to Shun Yu's side and said anxiously, "Since we both came from that world, we should stand on the same side. Quickly get me out of here. I don't want to stay in this damned place for a second longer. This place is more terrible than the Imperial Prison." Imperial Prison. It was a new word. Shun Yu narrowed his eyes. According to Shun Yu's behavior, he could roughly guess what kind of place it was. Shun Yu didn't have much time left, so he calmly asked, "How did you get here?" "I don't know either. I was taking an afternoon nap in the workshop. When I opened my eyes, I became like this." Shun Yu only wanted to leave this place as soon as possible. He didn't have time to think about the deep meaning of Shun Yu's words. Shun Yu asked a few more questions, and Shun Yu answered all of them. Not long after, Shun Yu roughly understood what kind of era Shun Yu had lived in. He was now certain of a few things. First, transmigration was not controlled by humans, and the reason for it was currently unknown. Second, Shun Yu, Shun Qingran, and other transmigrators should have lived in an era thousands of years in the future. Everyone there was equal, there was no royal family, and the technology was far more advanced than Da Huan. Shun Yu didn't know what to say. He was afraid that the other party would be suspicious, so Shun Yu didn't dare to ask too much. Shun Yu was very interested in modern technology. Unfortunately, what Shun Yu knew was very shallow, so he could only give up. The sound of footsteps came from behind. Shun Yu understood that it was reminding him that time was up. "Finished talking?" A low voice came from behind. Shun Yu turned around. Sure enough, Shang Junlin, dressed in black, was walking out from the darkness. Hearing Shang Junlin's voice, Shun Yu unconsciously trembled. Because the original owner was a palace maid, she was also brought to watch the massacre. How could a person who grew up in a peaceful era, who had never even killed a chicken, adapt to such a bloody scene? For the first time, Shun Yu deeply understood how cruel the ancient era she lived in was. For some ancient people, killing people was as common as eating and drinking. Since that night, the last bit of fantasy she had about the Emperor was obliterated. Now that she saw the Emperor, she only wanted to find a crack to hide herself. Fortunately, Shang Junlin didn't pay much attention to her. Seeing Shun Yu's relaxed attitude beside Shang Junlin, Shun Yu's admiration for this fellow countryman rose several levels. "It's cold in the prison. It's time to go back." Shun Yu's hand felt warm. When he saw the man's slightly concerned eyes, he was startled. He didn't notice that his hand had become so cold in such a short time. His hand was held by the man, and a steady stream of warmth spread from his fingers to his heart. Shun Yu smiled. "Okay, Your Majesty. Let's go back. Did you find out anything?" Shun Yu shook his head. "Actually, I didn't have much hope. After my mother passed away, not to mention the residents of Northern Marquis, even the capital seemed to have been erased overnight. It's as if my mother had never appeared in Da Huan." When Shun Yu told Shang Junlin that he wanted to talk to Shun Yu alone, he used the excuse of looking for clues about his mother. Shun Yu's mother's case was indeed strange. Shang Junlin also asked the hidden dragon guards to investigate, but strangely, they couldn't find any useful clues. Now that there was a woman who looked similar to Shun Yu, and she was deliberately placed in the palace, it was normal for Shun Yu to be concerned. "Don't worry." Shang Junlin was silent for a while and didn't ask about the details of the conversation between Shun Yu and Shun Yu. "Is Your Majesty comforting me?" Shun Yu laughed. "I expected this result, so I'm not too disappointed. Now that I have Your Majesty by my side, I'm no longer the child who wanted his mother's company." The two of them walked in the dark and cold prison hand in hand, and a steady stream of enthusiasm came from beside them. Shun Yu tilted his head and looked at Shang Junlin's handsome side profile and sharp eyes. This kind of man, standing at the peak of power, would give in for me, and would show gentleness in small details. It's It's so easy to move my heart. Your Majesty. Shun Yu suddenly stopped, and Shang Junlin looked at him in confusion. Shun Yu was about to say something, but his gaze froze. He saw two sneaky figures passing by not far away from them, and then he looked at them again. There were only a few palace servants far behind them. Young Master he. Shun Yu's mind exploded, and he didn't have time to think. He pulled Shang Junlin and ran in the direction of the sneaky figures. Your Majesty, is there someone following us secretly? Shun Yu was exhausted, and he was panting. Are you referring to the hidden dragon guards? The situation was urgent, and Shun Yu couldn't watch young Master he being taken away by the King of Yu's men. I saw a few suspicious figures, and I suspect that someone is going to break out of the prison. Shang Junlin didn't say much, and he directly ordered the hidden dragon guards. Shun Yu pulled his sleeve. Your Majesty, Shun Yu, I'll arrange for someone to go over. As they had to take care of Shun Yu's body, they were slower than the hidden dragon guards. When they arrived, the criminals were already subdued. Shun Yu was half blocked by Shang Junlin, and he looked at the man who took the sword from his subordinate. He lifted the chin of one of the criminals and asked, Tell me, who ordered you to come here? You are a tyrant who kills innocent people. Even if you kill me, I won't tell you. Oh, is that so? Shang Junlin kept his sword, and blood dripped from the sharp blade. The person who was talking just now had already fallen to the ground, and he died with his eyes wide open. The prison guard who was bribed and the other two prisoners were scared out of their wits. They didn't expect Shang Junlin to suddenly appear in the prison, and they also didn't expect Shang Junlin to kill them so quickly. Shun Yu smelled the strong smell of blood, and he popped his head out from behind Shang Junlin. Other than the one who was lying in a pool of blood, there were 3 other prisoners in the prison. 2 of them were dressed as prison guards, and their heads were lowered. The last one was dressed in a prisoner's uniform, and he was curled up against the wall. His hair covered his face, and his face couldn't be seen clearly. Shun Yu poked Shang Junlin, but there was no response. He coughed. Your Majesty, let's send someone to check on the prisoners. No. One of the prison guards said subconsciously, but he suddenly realized something and his face turned pale. Unfortunately, no one would listen to him. As soon as Shun Yu finished speaking, the hidden dragon guards walked to young Master he under Shang Junlin's instructions. They ignored young Master he's struggle and rudely removed the hair on young Master he's face. When Shang Junlin saw young Master he's face, he squinted his eyes, and a terrifying aura exploded from his body. That was not the real young Master he. No matter how similar the body shape was, it couldn't hide the fact that he wasn't young Master he. It seems that I have been too lenient on all of you. The prison guards who rushed over after receiving the news heard what Shang Junlin said. Their legs turned to jelly, and they all knelt down. Your Majesty, please forgive us for our negligence. Shang Junlin didn't even look at them. He walked to the prison guard who had been silent all this while, and pointed his sword at his neck. Raise your head. The prison guard didn't move. Shang Junlin exerted some force, and the tip of the sword slowly pierced into the skin of the prison guard's neck. Blood slowly seeped out. The prison guard panicked. He could feel the murderous aura from Shang Junlin. If he didn't raise his head, he would die regardless of whether he was young Master he or not. Shun Yu was still standing at a safe spot with 2 hidden dragon guards beside him. He saw the prison guard slowly raise his head, and he saw an old face. It wasn't young Master he. Shang Junlin didn't kill a second prison guard. He threw his sword away and wiped his hands with a handkerchief that his subordinate passed to him. He said coldly, Go and investigate. The moment Shun Yu realized that something was wrong, the hidden dragon guards had already taken control of the prison. Not long after, someone brought in a young man who was completely paralyzed. He was also dressed as a prison guard, and after he was thrown back into the prison, he kept trembling. Shun Yu sized up this young Master he, who would bring about a bloodbath in the future. He was still very young and could be considered handsome. However, his complexion was too pale, which damaged his beauty. After young Master he was found, Shang Junlin didn't want to stay any longer. He directly changed the guards of the prison. Shun Yu didn't care about what happened to the previous guards. He was sent back to Yuzhong Palace by Shang Junlin, and there were a few hidden dragon guards following him in the dark. Shen Yu knew that his actions today were too rash. It was normal for Shang Junlin to be on guard against him. Young master, he was secretly imprisoned, and he shouldn't know about this now. After entering the palace, Shen Yu had been thinking about how to tell Shang Junlin that someone wanted to secretly kidnap young master He. However, before he could find a reason, he was sent to the prison because of Shen Yu. He also happened to bump into the prison guard who was about to break out. He didn't know if Shang Junlin would believe him if he explained it this way. That group of people's movements were too secretive. First, they bribed the jailer in the secret prison and secretly replaced the real young master He. They also arranged enough people outside to receive them. If Shen Yu hadn't coaxed Shang Junlin to come to the secret prison, this group of people might have taken the real young master He out without anyone knowing. A day later, Shen Yu did not wait for Shang Junlin to condemn him. His movements were not restricted, and he did not feel like he was being watched at all times. Rather than saying that those people were here to monitor him, it was better to say that they were here to protect his safety. Your Majesty has arrived. Shen Yu suddenly stood up. His movement was so big that he knocked over the teacup on the table. Why are you in such a hurry? Shang Junlin saw Shen Yu holding the teacup in a hurry as soon as he came in. I was just thinking about Your Majesty, and now Your Majesty is here. Doesn't this mean that Your Majesty and I have telepathy? Shen Yu was flustered for a moment, and he quickly adjusted himself. Genius. 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Website, mbk50. CC. Chapter 11. Shen Yu pretended to be ignorant. Your Majesty, what are you talking about? What do I have to say to Your Majesty? Your Majesty, do you want to hear me say that I like? Shen Yu, Shang Junlin interrupted him faintly, you know what I'm talking about. If I say that it's really just a coincidence, will Your Majesty believe me? Shen Yu lowered his eyebrows and his voice was full of uncertainty. What do you think? Shang Junlin asked him back. I don't think so, Shen Yu answered in his heart. If it was him, he definitely wouldn't believe it. How could there be so many coincidences in the world? If there were too many coincidences, most of them were man-made. Your Majesty, Shen Yu took a deep breath. Today, I really just want to see Shen Yu to solve my doubts. Whether you believe it or not, the other thing is really just a coincidence. Shen Yu didn't expect that the day he chose would coincide with the kidnapping of young Master He. He didn't know whether God was helping him or harming him. Let's not talk about this for now. Let me ask you, why did you insist that the suspicious people were trying to break into the prison? How did you find out about He Jinyuan? Shang Junlin approached Shen Yu and felt a strong sense of oppression. His eyes were fixed on Shen Yu's face, not letting go of any changes in his expression. Shen Yu's expression didn't change, but he was a little flustered in his heart. He Jinyuan was the name of young Master He. He could find a reasonable excuse for any of the things that happened that day, except for this. Shang Junlin reached out and touched Shen Yu's cheek. His hand was as warm as usual, but it gave Shen Yu a sense of coolness for no reason. Shen Yu, don't lie to me. Your Majesty, Shen Yu reached out and covered the man's hand. Your Majesty, you have to believe that I will always be on your side. Of course, I know that. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in Yuzhong Palace right now, but in the dark prison. Shang Junlin's eyes were dark, and his fingertips were caressing Shen Yu's face. He was very confident in the hidden dragon guards that he had groomed. Other than the few people that he had purposely revealed, no one else would know that He Jinyuan was in the secret prison. Shen Yu shouldn't know either, unless he was involved with those people. Shen Yu had interacted with Prince Yu before entering the palace. Was there any other connection between them that he didn't know? Seeing that Shang Junlin's eyes were getting darker and darker, Shen Yu quickly searched through his memories. He had to dispel Shang Junlin's suspicions. Shang Junlin was here to live a carefree life. There was no reason for him to torment himself after being reborn. Your Majesty, before I entered the palace, I happened to hear someone talk about the secret prison and the exchange of prisoners. It was said by someone who looked similar to Your Majesty in front of his subordinates. At that time, I only heard it once. That day, when I met a sneaky person in the secret prison, I suddenly remembered this matter and my mouth was faster than my brain. Shinyu reflected on it after the incident. The result was that he was too impulsive at that time. At that time, he only thought that he couldn't let Prince Yu's people take He Jinyuan away. He didn't expect that a young master from an aristocratic family who stayed in the palace all year round due to illness shouldn't be so sensitive. I know what I'm saying is unbelievable, but that's the truth. Everything is a coincidence that couldn't be more coincidental. Your Majesty, you chose to ask me alone because you couldn't find any traces of human activity. That's right. I didn't find anything. Shang Junlin didn't mind picking a fight with Shinyu and said, "You better pray that I will never find anything. I didn't do anything. Your Majesty can investigate as you wish." Feeling that the atmosphere had eased, Shinyu turned his head and rubbed the hand on his face. "Your Majesty, please don't scare me in the future. I'm timid and can't stand being scared." "I think you are very brave." The skin under his hand was warmed and felt better than the best warm jade. Under Shinyu's bright and innocent eyes, Shang Junlin took back his hand and calmly rubbed his index finger with his thumb. "Next, do you want to ask for compensation from me?" His noble son was very delicate and didn't want to be wronged at all. Shang Junlin remembered that a favorite concubine of the late emperor had raised a cat that was sent from a foreign country. That cat was beautiful and noble, and its eyes were clear, just like Shinyu. "Your Majesty really knows me. But this time, I don't want any reward. Your Majesty, please tell me the follow-up and satisfy my curiosity." Shinyu knew that in front of a person like Shang Junlin, the more open his attitude was, the better. "Aren't you afraid that I will continue to suspect you?" Shang Junlin was surprised. "Your Majesty, do you mean that you don't suspect me now?" Shinyu asked back. Shang Junlin lifted Shinyu's chin and looked at his face. "Sometimes, I really don't know if I should say that you are smart or that you have a big heart. I must be smart. How can a stupid person stand next to Your Majesty?" Shinyu didn't hesitate. "Your Majesty is always right." Shang Junlin let go of Shinyu's face and walked to the edge of the couch. "Come here. Don't you want to hear the follow-up?" Shinyu obediently walked to Shang Junlin and sat down. "I ordered people to investigate, but only a few people were found. The person behind the scenes was too cautious. He didn't show himself from beginning to end. Every order was passed down through several middlemen. The incident with young master he happened in secret. The court didn't hear anything about it." Shang Junlin ordered people to pay close attention to the movements of several ministers, but they still didn't find anything. The person behind the scenes wanted to push the blame to several ministers who were already in prison. "My people were busy for a few days, but all the clues were suddenly cut off midway. That person was sure that Your Majesty wouldn't say anything. Why don't Your Majesty bring the matter to the surface?" The two chatted for a while. Shang Junlin never treated Shinyu as a bird in a golden cage. Occasionally, Shinyu would ask about the previous court, and he would chat with him. Although they didn't talk much, it wasn't difficult to feel Shinyu's sensitivity to the court. It was really stupid of Count Shunbei to send such a son into the palace. During the morning court, Shang Junlin changed his usual behavior and announced that someone had broken out of prison. However, he didn't tell the details of the people who had been kidnapped. The ministers thought that it was Imperial Censor Zhong and the others who had been kidnapped. It was true that they wanted to save Imperial Censor Zhong and the others, but they didn't want to break out of prison. The current Shang Junlin wasn't tyrannical enough to make the ministers angry. What they wanted to know was how Imperial Censor Zhong had offended the emperor. "Leave this matter to Official Fang. In half a month, I want a satisfactory answer." Official Fang respectfully bowed. "Yes, Your Majesty." Ignoring the minister's surprise, Shang Junlin assigned a few more assistants to Official Fang. "If there's nothing else, you may leave." After giving the order, Shang Junlin planned to leave. "Your Majesty," the Minister of Rites stood up, "Your Majesty's birthday is coming soon. Will everything be as usual this year?" Everyone suddenly realized that it was almost His Majesty's birthday. In previous years, preparations would have started at this time. However, There were too many things happening this year and it was almost neglected. Shang Junlin, who was about to nod, thought of something and stopped himself. This matter can be discussed with Shen Gui Jun. All the ministers suddenly realized that their majesty was no longer alone. Shen Yu also heard the palace servants mention this matter. Your Majesty's birthday? Shen Yu asked while trimming the plum blossoms in the vase. Yes, Your Majesty's birthday is in half a month. Every year at this time, the palace will hold a birthday banquet. This year, Your Majesty has entered the palace. It will definitely be more lively than in previous years. The palace servants liked Shen Yu very much. Especially after the previous incident, their good impression of him had skyrocketed. Your Majesty, official Lu of the Ministry of Rites requests an audience. A palace servant came in to report. Why did the official Lu of the Ministry of Rites come to see me? Although he was puzzled, Shen Yu still asked the palace servant to invite him in. The official Lu of the Ministry of Rites himself was also very puzzled. Although Shen Yu was also a man, Shen Yu was the emperor's man after all. It was not good for him to see him as a man. He also told the emperor about his concerns after the court, but the emperor still asked him to come directly. Without any other choice, the official Lu of the Ministry of Rites had to come. This minister greets Your Majesty. Official Lu, you don't have to be so polite. Come, take a seat. It was not the first time that Shen Yu saw the official Lu of the Ministry of Rites. The last time they met was when he entered the palace. Official Lu directly explained his intentions. Shen Yu listened to their regulations and felt that there were no big problems. He picked out some small details and changed them. After the process was set, official Lu left. Shen Yu sat in the same place and was somewhat puzzled. This year should not be the day when the vassal kings returned to the capital. Why was there a vassal kings returning to the capital? Shen Yu decided to wait for Shang Junlin to come and ask him. In an inconspicuous mansion in the capital. When the King of Yu heard the news that the emperor was going to investigate, he only felt that his vision turned black. He did not understand why everything was different from what he imagined when he came to the capital. The emperor's style of doing things changed greatly. Everything he wanted to do failed. Every result made him want to vomit blood. He took a deep breath and asked, "Where are the people we sent out? Is there still no news at all?" In order to save the young master the King of Yu spent a lot of money to borrow a group of people. But now they were not brought out, and these people were all gone. The subordinate lowered his head and said with difficulty, "Yes. I shouldn't have counted on you, a group of wastes." The King of Yu paced a few steps. How is the aftermath? Will they investigate this? Your Highness, don't worry. They will definitely not find out. He was sure about this. Strictly speaking, the prison break did not go through their hands. Whether it was the order or the people used, it had nothing to do with the King of Yu. You can leave. All plans will be suspended for this period of time. The King of Yu waved his hand weakly. He really did not get any benefits from coming to the capital this time. No, it was not that he did not gain anything. Thinking of the concubine's son who always had strange ideas in the Count of Zhenbei's residence, the King of Yu narrowed his eyes. The news that the King of Yu and Shen Qingran hooked up again was passed to Shen Yu through Mu Shi's mouth. In the past, this servant thought that he was really loyal to the young master. I was really blind. Mu Shi curled her lips. Fortunately, the young master is clear-minded and was not deceived by that person. Your young master is smart. He is the one who deceives others. How can others deceive him? Shang Junlin's low voice came from outside the door. Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading URL, mbk50. cc. Chapter 12. Mu Shi didn't expect that Shang Junlin would come at this time. When he came in, he didn't let anyone inform him. Shang Junlin usually came to Yuzhong Palace at a fixed time, usually in the evening or at night. Because of this, Mu Shi usually chose to talk to Shen Yu in the morning. Even after entering the palace, Shen Yu didn't forget to let people keep an eye on the Count of Zhenbei's residence. The focus of attention was naturally Shen Qingran, the protagonist of the original novel. Every once in a while, there would be news from outside the palace. He didn't expect that the Prince of Yu and Shen Qingran had hooked up so early. It was even earlier than what Shen Yu saw in the novel. Was it because of his withdrawal? Well, at this time in his previous life, Shen Qingran had already entered the palace. The progress of their relationship could only be stagnant. Shang Junlin had already entered the room. Shen Yu didn't want to think too much. He quickly gathered his thoughts and got up to greet him. "Is your Majesty done with your work today?" Shang Junlin was very diligent in government affairs. He spent most of his time on official business every day. Sometimes, he even brought memorials to Yuzhang Palace. "If I didn't come at this time, I wouldn't have heard your little servant girl say such interesting things." Shang Junlin didn't answer Shen Yu's question. His hawk-like eyes fell on Mu Shi. "Tell me, who bullied our prince?" "Your Majesty, please forgive me." I. Mu Shi knelt down with a plop and kept her head lowered. "His Majesty is curious. It doesn't matter if you say it. At most, your master will be made fun of." Shen Yu didn't care. Mu Shi couldn't help but look at Shen Yu. She was surprised to find that there was no panic on Shen Yu's face. It seemed that asking her to say it wasn't a big deal. Shen Yu really didn't mind that Shang Junlin knew about this. The relationship between him and Shang Junlin was not a normal relationship between an emperor and an imperial concubine. Even if Mu Shi tried her best to hide it, Shang Junlin might have already found out about it. "Let me say it. Your Majesty, please don't make fun of me." Shen Yu sighed and walked to Shang Junlin's side. Pulling on his sleeve, he said with an aggrieved expression, "It's just that before entering the palace, someone who said that she liked me and couldn't live without me, turned around and got together with her Shu Di at home. It can be seen that the love that men talk about is just talk. You can't believe everything." "Oh." Shang Junlin took the opportunity to grab Shen Yu's waist and pull her close to him. He lowered his head and said intimately, "Then, is Gui Jun sad?" The man's voice was full of affection, with an indescribable meaning. Shen Yu's skin on the side of her neck turned a light pink under the man's hot breath. Her jade-like skin was dyed red, and the man's eyes darkened. His voice became low and hoarse. "Jun will help Gui Jun vent his anger, okay?" The atmosphere suddenly became ambiguous, and the arm around her waist tightened. Shen Yu looked at the man's dark eyes, and her heart tightened. The warm sunlight came in through the open window, and half of it fell on the two of them. Shen Yu felt that the arm around her waist was much hotter than the sunlight, as if it was going to burn. "Your Majesty." Shen Yu turned her head to avoid the man's gaze. "You're hurting me." Shang Junlin looked at him for a while and let go of his arm. "Gui Jun is so delicate. What will happen in the future?" His meaningful words successfully made the young man's cheeks blush, especially his earlobe, like a plump fruit that was tempting to be picked. Shang Junlin's fingers moved slightly, wanting to touch the young man's red earlobe. Away from the man's heat, Shen Yu slowly calmed down. If Shang Junlin was not still here, he would have rubbed his face. "Mu Shi, you can leave first." Shen Yu glanced at the maid kneeling at the side, and coughed softly. Mu Shi bowed her head and left. Shang Junlin came in alone. After Mu Shi left, only Shang Junlin and Shen Yu were left in the room. Shen Yu poured a cup of tea for himself. After drinking it, he felt that it was inappropriate, so he poured another cup. "Your Majesty, do you want some?" Shang Junlin took the cup and drank it. "Gui Jun, do you really not want Shen to vent your anger for you?" Shen Yu looked up at the man and was stunned. The man's face did not have any joking expression, and he was asking him very seriously. "Your Majesty, I don't care about what happened before I entered the palace. What's more, how can other people compare to your Majesty? With your Majesty here, what other people do has nothing to do with me." Shen Yu rubbed the teacup and said lightly, But if your Majesty can make them suffer, I'm very happy to see it." Shang Junlin only said one word before he was interrupted by Shen Yu. As for the two main characters in the book that he saw after his death, Shen Yu was happy to find trouble for them. The situation in the imperial court changed rapidly. Fang Jun was a humble official promoted by Shang Junlin after he ascended the throne. He enforced the law impartially and was very talented in investigating cases. He was one of Shang Junlin's direct subordinates and held a position in the Supreme Court. His current position was not high. After Shang Junlin ascended the throne, he began to cultivate his power in the imperial court on a large scale, so there were not many people he could use. The more he investigated, the more Fang Jun felt that this case was not simple. He originally wanted to investigate the person who planned to break the prison, but he did not expect that what he found was evidence of Imperial Censor Zhong's corruption and perversion of the law. One after another, it was a ghastly sight. He finally understood why Imperial Censor Zhong was suddenly imprisoned. The people who helped him with the case looked at the evidence in silence. Not long ago, they felt that Imperial Censor Zhong was unjustly punished. Now, those memories were like slaps to their faces. Their faces hurt. Fang Jun, these things were hot in their hands. Most importantly, they did not know the Emperor's attitude. Did the Emperor know what Imperial Censor Zhong did? If he knew, how much did he know? Why didn't he announce it when Imperial Censor Zhong was imprisoned? I'll go to the palace first. You all must not act rashly and do not leak the news, otherwise, this official knows. Fang Jun, don't worry. They looked at each other and understood that they could no longer stay out of this matter. Imperial Censor Zhong took the evidence into the palace and talked with Shang Junlin for an entire afternoon in the imperial study. No one knew what they talked about, but the next day, Fang Jun's words set off a huge wave in the imperial court. How could it be? The officials looked at each other in dismay. There were also a few who obviously knew the inside story, averting their eyes and not daring to look at the man on the throne. Did the Emperor know? How much did he know? Were their secrets also exposed? Countless questions hovered in their minds. In their panic, they could not help but pray that the Emperor did not know about their secret. After the commotion, an official stood up and asked, Fang Jun, may I ask if you can verify the authenticity of the evidence? I have verified all the evidence and witnesses. The evidence is conclusive and there is no possibility of framing. Fang Jun knew what they were puzzled about. When he first received the evidence, he also had the same doubts. After confirming that there was no mistake, he dared to enter the palace to meet the Emperor. The discussion in the hall grew louder. No one would have thought that Fang Jun's investigation of the prison break would lead to such a huge discovery. So, the Emperor had thrown Censor Zhong into prison without any explanation. Was it because he knew about this, or was it a blind cat that hit a dead mouse? Are you done discussing? An emotionless voice came from the throne. The officials suddenly quieted down. The hall was so quiet that a pin drop could be heard. Shang Junlin's gaze casually swept across the officials. A few of the weaker ones almost knelt down. With one hand supporting his chin, Shang Junlin said coldly, Fang Jun, tell me everything you found out. Fang Jun cupped his hands and said loudly, guilty official Zhong Yuhua, in the 17th year of Qingping, seized 2,000 mu of fertile land. In the 21st year of Qingping, in the large hall, only Fang Jun's voice could be heard. It took almost half an hour to finish reading all the evidence. In the silence, Shang Junlin's cold voice sounded, is there anyone else pleading for Imperial Censor Zhong? No one dared to answer. A few days ago, they were all kneeling here and begging the Emperor to release Imperial Censor Zhong. What was the result? It was all a waste of their sincerity. An old official trembled as he stood up. Your Majesty, was this the reason why the guilty official Zhong was arrested? Shang Junlin, what do you think, Elder Chen? Elder Chen, this official was too biased. Shang Junlin, Fang Jun, I will entrust Imperial Censor Zhong's case to you. Do not disappoint me. Fang Jun, this official accepts the order. I will not disappoint Your Majesty. The morning court session ended with complicated feelings. Imperial Censor Zhong's case also spread throughout the capital. Those who were crying out for Imperial Censor Zhong were all dumbfounded. There were also a small number of people who refused to believe it. However, with the evidence, they had no choice but to believe it. The news also spread throughout the palace. I already said that Your Majesty would not kill innocent people. Imperial Censor Zhong's arrest was indeed his own fault. Yes, who would have thought that Imperial Censor Zhong, who has always been fair and incorruptible, would secretly be a person who preys on the common people. Outside, there are rumors about how cruel your majesty is. But think about it carefully. We have been in the palace for so many years, but we have never seen your majesty casually find a reason to punish us. That's right. And those people who were killed last time, didn't they explain later that they were colluding with foreign officials and secretly spreading news from the palace to outside the palace? If you ask me, those people deserved to die. Hearing the discussion in front of him, Shen Yu stopped in his tracks, and the people walking beside him also stopped. However, they had caused a commotion. The few palace servants who were talking stopped talking and walked over. Shen Yu pulled Shang Junlin to the side to hide. Unfortunately, it was too late. The palace servants who came to investigate bumped into them. Your Majesty, with a plop sound, the palace servant knelt down. Thinking of what he had just said, the palace servant's face turned pale. When the others heard the noise, they knelt down to pay their respects. Their bodies were slightly trembling, and their faces were very ugly. Shang Junlin's face was cold and did not speak. Shen Yu pulled his sleeve. Seeing that Shang Junlin did not show any signs of speaking, he had no choice but to send these palace servants away. After everyone left, Shang Junlin coldly asked, "Am I so shameful? When I met a few palace servants, they wanted to pull me away to hide. Your Majesty, what are you thinking? I just don't want to scare them. Look at them, they are so scared that they are trembling when they walk." Shen Yu did not understand how he made Shang Junlin unhappy, so he subconsciously smoothed his hair. Realizing his gaffe, Shang Junlin frowned. Your Majesty." Shen Yu suddenly approached and interrupted Shang Junlin's words. "Does your Majesty have anything to say?" Shang Junlin's line of sight was suddenly occupied by a magnified and stunning face. He was startled. "What?" Just now, after hearing what those little palace maids said, "Do you have any thoughts?" Shen Yu's eyes were full of interest. "Does your Majesty not want to explain what those palace maids said to the public?" Genius 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Reading Website, mbk50. CC. Chapter 13. Your Majesty, please tell me. Shen Yu was unwilling to give up. "Gui Jun, mind your own business." Shang Junlin's tone was somewhat unhappy. "You shouldn't meddle in things that you shouldn't." "I know." Shen Yu ended the topic with Liu Russian. The atmosphere suddenly quieted down. Shang Junlin didn't know why Shen Yu didn't continue. He also didn't know why this was what he wanted, but it made him feel worse. Even in winter, the scenery of the imperial palace didn't appear bleak. Instead, it had a different flavor. The cold-resistant flowers and plants offered by the southern kingdom grew freely. Not far away, there were beautiful red plum blossoms. Under the decoration of various colors, the winter became different. The two walked forward in silence. Shen Yu's eyes were full of the scenery around him. Because of his health, he could only stay indoors most of the winter. If he was exposed to the wind, he would have to lie down for 10 days to half a month. If Imperial Physician Ji Yu hadn't nursed his body this winter, he definitely wouldn't have been able to walk outside without any worries like now. It snowed lightly last night. The places where no one walked were covered with a light layer of white. Shen Yu looked around as he walked. He didn't notice that the man beside him had been looking at him. "I don't say it because I'm the emperor. I don't need to explain to others what I do." An indifferent voice came. Shen Yu paused. He suddenly realized that His Majesty seemed to be answering his question. Shen Yu stopped and looked sideways at Shang Junlin. "But if your Majesty doesn't say it, they will make wild guesses and misinterpret your Majesty's true intentions. Gui Jun seems to be very concerned about my reputation." Shang Junlin's tone seemed to be stating a fact. "I'm now one with your Majesty. Your Majesty is my husband. Isn't it normal for me to be concerned about my husband's reputation? Is that what you think?" Shang Junlin looked at Shen Yu ambiguously. Shen Yu was afraid of the cold. Whenever he went out, he had to wear thick clothes. The thin young man didn't look bloated even if he wore thick clothes. It couldn't hide his transparent temperament. The young man's eyes were clear and his expression was calm. It seemed that what he said was sincere. Your Majesty, what else do you think I would think? Shun Yu tilted his head. Actually, Your Majesty, you can take it that I don't like their behavior and don't want them to die peacefully. Shun Yu's eyes darkened. In his previous life, the king of Yu and others had seized the throne by accumulating many little drops into an ocean. To be honest, he didn't care who the throne would eventually fall on. However, as long as he was alive, the king of Yu wouldn't be able to get what he wanted like in his previous life. After staying outside for a long time, Shun Yu's face was red from the cold. Shang Junlin reached out and touched it gently. I feel your kindness. Shun Yu. No, how did she feel my feelings? Your Majesty, you don't have to be embarrassed. I already know your feelings for me. Shang Junlin suddenly realized that it was the secret information from the hidden dragon guards. He changed the topic. I will listen to you on this matter. Until he returned to Yuzhang Palace, Shun Yu still didn't understand why Shang Junlin's attitude was so strange. Because of this matter, Shun Yu forgot to ask Shang Junlin about the return of the vassal kings. Forget it, I will ask next time. Shun Yu murmured. Your Majesty, this is the revised schedule of the banquet. Please take a look. Shun Yu took it and looked through it carefully. He said, tell them to follow the arrangement. Yes. After the servant left, Shun Yu stood by the window and looked into the distance. Yuzhang Palace was not far from the emperor's bedroom. He didn't know what the original designer of Yuzhang Palace was thinking. From where Shun Yu was standing now, he could see the corner of the emperor's bedroom. He couldn't see the specific figure, but it was enough to remind him of the person. After standing for a while, Shun Yu felt a little cold. He walked back to the table and sat down. In his previous life, Shun Qingran was not conferred the title of emperor when he entered the palace. He also didn't participate in the banquet. Shun Yu didn't participate in the banquet, so he didn't know what happened at the banquet. The process of the banquet was complicated. Fortunately, Shun Yu had similar experience in his previous life. He also had the help of people who were familiar with the process. It was quite easy for him to handle it. With the arrival of the emperor's birthday, the news that Fang Jun announced became more and more shocking. This time, with the emperor's permission, the news was not deliberately hidden. The people and the officials almost received the news at the same time. Just like when the officials first received the news, everyone's first reaction was disbelief. Censor Zhong was used to maintaining his reputation. The people in the capital had a good impression of him. Suddenly, they found out that he had done so many things behind the scenes. They were unwilling to believe it. However, the evidence given by the imperial court was too sufficient. The shocking facts were in front of them. They had no choice but to believe it. So, Censor Zhong was arrested not because he angered that person, but because his crimes were unforgivable. But, if that's the case, why didn't they announce his crimes from the beginning? That person must have a reason for doing so. Think about it, after Censor Zhong was imprisoned, didn't they catch a few more of his accomplices? Yes, it's all thanks to His Majesty's wisdom and martial prowess. He had anticipated that someone would break into the prison and set up an inescapable net to catch those people. Everyone talked at once. A few people who were leading the conversation looked at each other and quietly left the crowd. These people were ordered to do things by Shun Yu. Shun Yu was in the imperial palace, but there were not many restrictions. He had a dark network. Although it was not as large as in his previous life, it was not difficult to do some small things in the capital. Young master, the matter you ordered has been completed. Mu Shi whispered as she poured Shun Yu a cup of tea. What's the situation outside? Shun Yu picked up the teacup and took a sip. Everything is the same as before, except. Mu Shi's face revealed a strange expression. Second young master broke his leg. For some reason, he angered the Marquis. In a fit of anger, the Marquis put him under house arrest. Shun Yu suddenly thought of the day when Shang Junlin asked him if he wanted to help him vent his anger. He felt that Shun Qingran's matter must have something to do with him. However, would the monarch of a country really help him vent his anger over such a small matter? Shun Yu's mood was indescribably complicated. He put down the teacup and asked, Do you know how Shen Qingran broke his leg? Mu Shi shook her head. Our people didn't find the reason. I will ask them to investigate carefully. No need. Shen Yu rubbed the sides of the cup. If this matter was really done by Shang Junlin, they might not be able to find anything even if they investigated further. Well, as an elder brother, when I heard that my younger brother broke his leg, should I send someone to ask about it? If young master sends someone, the Marquis and second young master will definitely be happy. Mu Shi's eyes flashed with a trace of craftiness. After leaving the manor for so long, the Marquis of Zhenbei would definitely welcome Shen Yu if he sent someone to the Marquis's manor. As for second young master, he had to pretend to be happy even if he was not happy. Previously, when they were in the Marquis's manor, second young master often bullied her young master because Madame Ayu was favored. He even snatched their normal things. Mu Shi had long remembered this. Well, you can arrange it as you see fit. He couldn't let Marquis Zhenbei forget that he still had a legitimate son who was sent to the palace by him. Shen Yu didn't want to see the scene of Marquis Zhenbei and Madame Ayu as close as a family after he left. Yes. Mu Shi thought of countless ways to embarrass the Marquis's manor, but she rejected them one by one. She had to think of a way to make the Marquis's manor feel uncomfortable, but others couldn't criticize her. Why didn't Imperial Physician Ji Yu come today? Shen Yu suddenly remembered that Imperial Physician Ji Yu seemed to have not come for a few days. Imperial Physician Ji Yu asked for leave a few days ago. He said that the child at home caused some trouble and had to deal with it. Mu Shi brought the warm medicine. Before Imperial Physician Ji Yu left, he prepared the herbs that young master needed and also left a token. If young master needs it, you can go to him at any time. Why? Shen Yu remembered that some time ago, Mu Shi was frightened by Shang Junlin, so he deliberately gave her a leave. Imperial Physician Ji Yu didn't come to Yuzhong Palace after that. It must have happened during that time. Mu Shi's words also confirmed his guess. It's my fault. I wanted to find time to tell young master, but these days, for some reason, His Majesty came to Yuzhong Palace whenever he was free. Mu Shi was afraid that it would be like last time, so she didn't find a chance to tell Shen Yu. It's okay. Did Imperial Physician Ji Yu say where to find him? A pharmacy on West Street in the capital. Shen Yu's understanding of Imperial Physician Ji Yu came from that person in his previous life. He didn't even know the specific time when Imperial Physician Ji Yu was punished. He asked Mu Shi because he was worried that Imperial Physician Ji Yu suffered the same thing as in his previous life when he didn't know. Little did he know that Imperial Physician Ji Yu was also afraid at this time. In a secluded courtyard, a young man in black was practicing swordsmanship. The young man in light blue clothes looked at the young man in the courtyard with a gentle gaze and felt very lucky. When the young man noticed Imperial Physician Ji Yu, he put away his sword and ran over. Imperial Physician Ji Yu touched the young man's sweaty hair and said, "I have to go back to work tomorrow. You stay at home and don't cause trouble. Are you going to take care of that Gui Jun again?" The young man curled his lips. "Don't be rude. Gui Jun is my benefactor. You should respect him." Knowing that this child was stubborn, Imperial Physician Ji Yu told him what had happened these days. "I didn't know you encountered such a dangerous situation." The young man was scared after listening. He hugged the young man's waist and said in a muffled voice, "Shen Gui Jun is my benefactor from now on." In a place where Imperial Physician Ji Yu couldn't see, Ji Yu Huai's eyes were dark. At noon, the imperial chef in the palace made new snacks. The white pastries were decorated with bright plum blossoms. The fragrance was sweet but not greasy. Shen Yu couldn't help but eat a little more. He was a little full, so he walked outside to digest. When Shang Junlin came, he saw Shen Yu's lazy appearance. He walked over and hugged Shen Yu. Shen Yu leaned on him and helped him walk. Shang Junlin said, "If you're tired, go in and rest." Shen Yu shook his head, "I'm digesting. I'm a little full." Jin was wondering what happened to you. Shang Junlin's eyes had a hint of a smile. "Why are you still full?" "It's because the new imperial chef sent by your majesty made delicious snacks." Shen Yu pretended to complain. "Then Jin should transfer him away." Shang Junlin lowered his head and approached. "No, it's mine now." Shun Yu hurriedly turned his head and his voice suddenly disappeared. His lips just happened to touch Shang Junlin's sharp jawline. Genius. 1 second. Remember this website, www.bk50. CC Literature Mobile Version Website, mbk50. CC. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.